In the middle of a shallow mountain lake, more than 7,000 feet above the sea, there once stood a city built on mud and reeds. It had no wheels that turned for labor, no horses, no iron. Its builders raised it by hand, basket by basket, driving stakes of willow into soft lake bottom and filling the spaces between them with black silt dredged from the water. And yet within 200 years, that city held perhaps 200,000 people, more than any city in Europe except the greatest. And it was clean and orderly, and threaded with canals down which canoes moved in the early light, carrying flowers and maize and salt and fish. Its market swallowed 60,000 traders on a busy day. Its temples were washed with lime until they glowed white above the water, and painted at their summits with red and blue and yellow. And from those summits on certain days, blood ran down the steps in dark ribbons while the whole valley watched. The people who built it did not call themselves Aztecs. They called themselves the Mexica, and they remembered that they had come from somewhere else, from a place they named Aztlan, the place of whiteness, or the place of herons, which no one has ever found. They remembered that they had arrived in this valley late, poor, unwanted, driven from one patch of ground to another, and that they had eaten snakes and flies' eggs, and the roots of water plants when there was nothing else. They remembered being slaves, and they told themselves that all of it had been arranged by their God, who had promised them that one day everything they could see from the water would be theirs. For a while it was. Then, in the space of 2 years, a few hundred strangers came out of the eastern sea with steel and horses, and a sickness nobody had a name for, and the city on the lake was pulled apart stone by stone, and the lake itself was slowly drained, and a new city was laid over the bones of the old one. So that today, if you walk through the center of Mexico City, you are walking on top of it, and the ground beneath your feet is still sinking, still settling into the soft lake bed, taking the cathedral and the palaces down with it, inch by inch, year by year. This is the entire story of the Aztec Empire, where the Mexica came from, how they climbed from nothing to mastery in 5 generations. What their world looked like from the inside, what they believed about the sun and about death, and how it all ended. Settle yourself now. Let the lights go low, and let your breathing slow, and if you feel like it, leave a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from, and what time it is there. I read them all. And then let the rest of this drift over you like water. Long before anyone in the valley had heard the name Mexica, the high basin of central Mexico was already ancient ground. It sits like a bowl in the mountains, ringed by volcanoes, 2 of them white with snow at the southern rim, and in the bottom of that bowl lay a chain of shallow lakes, connected and swampy, rising in the rainy season and shrinking back in the dry months, salty at the center and fresher at the edges where the springs came down. Reeds grew thick along the margins. Ducks came in enormous flocks in winter, so many that the sound of them lifting off the water carried for miles. The air was thin and cool. Frost could come at night even in the warm months, and the light in the mornings was very clear. People had lived around those lakes for thousands of years, growing maize and beans and squash on the slopes, fishing with nets, hunting deer in the pine forests above. And roughly 1,000 years before the Mexica arrived, on a plain in the northeast corner of the valley, there had risen the greatest city the region had ever seen. We do not know what its people called it, and we do not know for certain what language they spoke. We call it Teotihuacan, which is a name given to it much later by the Mexica themselves, and which means something close to the place where the gods were made, or the place where men become gods. At its height, it covered 8 square miles and held perhaps 100,000 people, laid out on a rigid grid, with a broad avenue running north to south for over 2 miles, and 2 enormous pyramids of stone and rubble rising beside it, one to the sun and one to the moon, though those names too were given later and may have nothing to do with what the builders intended. Along the avenue stood apartment compounds with painted walls, whole neighborhoods of craftsmen, quarters where people from distant regions lived among their own kind, speaking their own tongues, trading obsidian and shell and the green feathers of tropical birds. And then, sometime around the year 550, it burned. The temples along the central avenue were deliberately smashed and set alight, and the city emptied over the following century, and no one has ever fully explained why. Drought, perhaps. Internal revolt, more likely, judging by the fact that the destruction was aimed so carefully at the buildings of the elite. The population scattered into smaller towns around the lakes. But the ruins remained. They were still standing when the Mexica came, 800 years later, half buried in grass, the pyramids like hills, the painted plaster fading. And the Mexica walked among them and could not imagine that ordinary human beings had raised such things. So they told themselves that the gods had gathered there in the darkness before the present world began, and that one of them had thrown himself into a fire to become the sun, and that the rest had followed, and that this was where it happened. They buried their own offerings among the older stones. They took the city's memory into their own religion, the way a family takes in an orphan and gives it a name. Between the fall of Teotihuacan and the coming of the Mexica, there was a second great power, closer in time and even closer in the Aztec imagination. Its capital was Tula, north of the valley in drier country, and its people were called the Toltecs. Tula was smaller than Teotihuacan, a city of maybe 30 or 40,000, with pyramids and colonnaded halls and stone warriors standing on the temple summit, carved with butterfly breastplates and feathered headdresses and holding spear throwers at their sides. It flourished for perhaps 250 years, and then it too collapsed. Around the year 1150, burned and looted, the great figures thrown down. But the Toltecs became, for everyone who came after, the standard of civilization itself. To say that something was Toltec was to say that it was skillfully made. The word came to mean craftsman. Later peoples told stories of Toltec farmers whose maize ears grew so large a man could carry only one, of cotton that came out of the ground already colored, of a wise ruler named Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl, who forbade human sacrifice, was tricked by a rival god into drunkenness and shame, and sailed away east on a raft of serpents, promising to return. Every dynasty that rose afterward in central Mexico tried to prove that it had Toltec blood, married into families that claimed it, or simply invented the connection outright. So the valley into which the Mexica eventually stumbled was not empty, and it was not innocent. It was a landscape of ruins and inheritances, of small city-states crowded around the lakeshore, each with its own temple pyramid and its own dialect and its own royal house, each descended, or claiming to be descended, from something greater. Culhuacan on the southern shore held the strongest Toltec claim of all. Azcapotzalco on the western shore was growing fast and hungry. Texcoco lay across the water to the east, on the fresher side of the lake with orchards on its hills. Xochimilco in the south grew flowers and vegetables on artificial garden plots built out into the water. Chalco lay further south still. There were dozens of these places, sometimes allied, more often at war, trading and intermarrying and raiding each other's fields, and they had been doing this for 200 years by the time the last wanderers came down out of the north. Those wanderers were not welcome. Nobody had asked them to come. The valley was full. The Mexica told the story of their own beginning many times, and they told it differently depending on who was listening and what they needed it to prove. But the shape of it stayed the same. They said that they had come from an island in the middle of a lake, in a country to the north or northwest, and that the island was called Aztlan. From this word we get the name Aztec, which nobody in the empire ever used for themselves, and which was popularized by European scholars only in the 18th and 19th centuries. In their own mouths they were Mexica, or Tenochtitlan after the city they built, or Culhua Mexica when they wanted to remind others of their borrowed noble ancestry. Aztlan, in the tellings, was a good place. There were herons on the water and reeds along the shore. The people fished and hunted ducks and paddled canoes and had everything they needed. There was a hill nearby with 7 caves in it, and from those caves, in the old stories, 7 tribes had emerged into the world, one after another, and gone their separate ways into the south. The Mexica were the last to leave. They were always the last in their own telling. The youngest brother, the latecomer, the one who arrives when the good land has already been taken and has to make something out of what is left. Whether Aztlan existed at all is one of the honest open questions of Mexican archaeology. There are candidate sites, lagoons in the west coast states, islands in Nayarit, marshy country in Michoacán, and each has its defenders, and none has been proven. It may be a real place remembered imperfectly. It may be a homeland invented backward to explain a migration that was messier and slower than the story allows. What is not in doubt is the broader movement. Around the 12th century, groups of people speaking Nahuatl, the language the Mexica spoke, moved south into the central highlands from the arid north. The valley peoples called such newcomers Chichimeca, a word that carried a whiff of contempt, meaning roughly the lineage of dogs, though many proud dynasties later claimed it happily enough. These were hunters and gatherers of the dry lands, or half-farmers at best, dressed in animal skins, carrying bows. The Mexica said their journey began in the year they called One Flint, which by our reckoning falls somewhere around 1111, and that it lasted well over 200 years. That is a long walk for a distance a determined person could cover in a few weeks. What it really describes is generations of movement, settling for a season or a decade, planting a crop, being pushed on, settling again. They carried their god with them in a bundle, on the shoulders of 4 priests called the god-bearers, and it was the god who told them when to stop and when to move. The god was Huitzilopochtli, whose name means hummingbird of the left, or hummingbird of the south, since the left hand pointed south in their reckoning of the world. He was not one of the great old gods of Mesoamerica. He was theirs alone, a tribal god, small at first, a voice in a bundle of cloth and bone. In the story of his birth, his mother Cotalicu, she of the serpent's skirt, was sweeping the temple on a hill called Coatepec when a ball of soft feathers drifted down from the sky. She tucked it into her waistband, and it vanished, and she found herself pregnant. Her 400 other children, the stars of the southern sky, and her daughter Coyolcauqui, whose face was painted with bells, took this as a disgrace and came up the hill armed to kill her. And at the moment they reached the summit, Huitzilopochtli was born fully grown and armored, holding a weapon of fire shaped like a serpent. And he cut his sister down and threw her body from the top of the hill so that it broke apart as it fell, and he scattered his 400 brothers across the sky. That is the sun rising. The stars and the moon are driven off every dawn, and it happens again every day, and it is a fight, and it is not guaranteed to be won. This idea sits underneath everything else the Mexica did. Hold on to it. We will come back to it when we reach the top of the temple. On the road, then, they were led by this god and by his priests, who interpreted what he wanted. They stopped at a place called Coatepec, named after the hill in the story, and built a dam there and made a small lake and were happy, and there was a faction among them who wanted to stay. The god disagreed. In the harshest version of the story, he killed the leaders of that faction in the night and opened their chests and took their hearts, and the rest of the people broke the dam and moved on in the morning without speaking of it. They passed by Tula, already in ruins. They camped at Chapultepec, the hill of the grasshopper, on the western edge of the lake, where fresh springs came out of the rock. It is a park today, in the middle of Mexico City, with a castle on top of it and families walking under the trees on Sunday afternoons. In the 14th century, it was the best piece of unclaimed ground within reach of the water, and the Mexica held it for perhaps 20 years. They were bad neighbors. The sources, including their own, do not really try to hide it. They were mercenaries and raiders. They took women from the surrounding towns. They were skilled fighters, hardened by the road, useful to whichever local lord hired them, and disliked by everyone else. In about 1319, the settled cities of the lakeshore agreed among themselves that this was enough, and combined forces, and drove them off Chapultepec with great slaughter. Their leader was captured and taken to Culhuacan and killed. The survivors scattered into the reeds and the shallow water, hiding among the rushes, eating what they could catch. And then they went, humbled, to the lords of Culhuacan and asked for land, and were given the worst land available, a stretch of black volcanic rock called Tizapan, south of the lake, where nothing much would grow, and the ground was crawling with rattlesnakes. The lords of Culhuacan expected this to solve the problem permanently. The Mexica ate the snakes. Tizapan was a field of old lava. The rock came down from a volcano in the south in some prehistoric eruption, and cooled into a black jagged crust, sharp underfoot, holding pockets of thin soil in its hollows. Nothing about it invited settlement. The lords of Culhuacan sent messengers after a while to see how many of the newcomers had died. The messengers came back confused. The Mexica were alive. They had learned to hunt the rattlesnakes and roast them, and they had found the pockets of soil and planted maize and chilies in them. And they had built low houses out of the lava rock itself, and they had put up a small temple to their god at the center of the settlement, and they were trading fish and reed mats and lake salt with the surrounding towns, and marrying into Culhua families, and generally behaving like people who intended to stay. This is the pattern of the entire Mexica story, and it is worth naming clearly at the start. Give them the worst ground, and they will farm it. Make them your servants, and they will learn everything you know while serving. Send them into a war expecting them to die, and they will come back with prisoners. There is something almost uncomfortable about how well the pattern holds. They were adaptable to a degree that unnerved their neighbors, and they were absolutely without shame about copying whatever they admired, and they had a founding story that told them, over and over, that being despised now meant nothing about what would happen later. The lords of Culhuacan began to use them as soldiers. In a war against Xochimilco, the flower-growing city in the south, the Mexica were sent in and told to bring back proof of the enemies they had defeated. They brought back sacks of ears. They had cut the ear from every captive they took, and they laid the sacks down in front of the Culhua lord and asked him to count. He was, by all accounts, appalled and also very impressed. What happened next broke everything. The Mexica asked the lord of Culhuacan, whose name was Achitomatl, for his daughter, so that she might come and be honored among them and become, as they put it, the mother of their god and a goddess herself. The lord agreed. It was a normal enough request in that world, where royal daughters were sent out constantly to bind one house to another. He sent her with attendants and gifts. Some days later, he was invited to a ceremony at the Mexica temple to see his daughter in her new dignity. He came with his nobles, carrying incense and flowers. The temple room was dark, lit only by a brazier, and there was a figure standing beside the altar in her garments. And the Lord came forward and threw his incense on the coals so that the light flared up. He saw then that the figure beside the altar was a Mexica priest, and that the priest was wearing his daughter's skin. The Mexica had understood the request in their own way, or had chosen to. In their theology, a woman who was killed and flayed became the goddess Tosi, our grandmother, and her skin worn by a priest was the goddess made present. They believed, or said they believed, that they were doing his family an enormous honor. He did not see it that way. He and his nobles fled the room screaming, and Culhuacan came for them with everything it had. And the Mexica were driven out of Tizapan and off the mainland entirely, into the marsh, into the reeds, into water up to their chests, holding their god's bundle above the surface. You may find that story hard to believe. Modern historians are split on it. It comes down to us through Mexica chroniclers writing after the conquest, and it may be a later invention, a way of explaining the break with Culhuacan, and of dramatizing the founding, since the story requires the Mexica to lose absolutely everything just before they gain everything. But even if the details are legend, the underlying fact is not. The Mexica were expelled. In the year they called Two House, around 1325, they had no land at all. What they had was a sign, promised long before. Their god had told the priests that they would know their home when they saw an eagle perched on a prickly pear cactus growing from a stone in the middle of the water. There is an island out in the western part of the lake, low and swampy, split by channels, useless for farming, claimed by nobody in particular, because nobody wanted it. It sat in the salty part of the water, between the territories of Azcapotzalco and Texcoco and Culhuacan, in the space where three ambitions overlapped, and therefore where none of them could easily plant a flag. There were springs on a nearby islet. There were fish and frogs and waterfowl, and, in the reeds, the small blue-green algae the Mexica scraped off the surface and pressed into cakes, a food so rich in protein that modern nutritionists study it. And on that island, the story says, in the gray of an early morning with mist lying on the water, the wandering priests came around a stand of rushes and saw the cactus growing out of a split rock, and on the cactus an eagle, and the eagle turned its head and looked at them. They wept, all of them, according to the chronicle, standing in the water, weeping. Then they built a shelter of reeds around the place where the cactus stood, and that shelter became the first temple of Huitzilopochtli, and around it they began, with nothing, to build Tenochtitlan. The name means the place of the prickly pear cactus on the stone. That eagle is on the Mexican flag today, 670 years later, holding a snake in its beak. The snake is a later addition, probably a misreading of an older glyph, but it has stuck, and nobody is in a hurry to remove it. Consider what they actually had to do next, because the myth tends to skip it, and the engineering is more remarkable than the omen. They had an island of soft mud and reeds, a few acres of dry ground at most, sitting in shallow brackish water. They had no stone on the island, no timber, no lime, no fresh water, beyond a few small springs, no fields, and no wealth to buy any of it. They had perhaps a few thousand people, and they were surrounded by established powers who considered them vermin. So they made land. The technique already existed around the southern lakes, at Xochimilco and Chalco, where the water was fresh and shallow. The Mexica took it and used it on a scale nobody had attempted. They drove stakes of willow into the lake bed in long rectangles, perhaps 30 feet by 300, and wove the gaps with branches and reeds to make a basket the size of a field. Then they filled the basket, hauling black mud up from the lake bottom in canoes, layer after layer, mixed with rotted vegetation and lakeweed, and later with human waste collected from the city in canoes and sold by the boatload, because nothing was wasted. As the willow stakes took root, they became living trees at the corners of each plot, and their roots knitted the whole structure into the lake floor and held it. These plots were called chinampas. They are usually described in English as floating gardens, which is charming and wrong. They did not float. They were anchored, artificial fields, standing a foot or two above the waterline, with canals between them wide enough for a canoe. Because the roots of the crops could always reach moisture, and because the mud was continually renewed from the lake, they did not need irrigation, and they did not need to lie fallow. A well-managed chinampa could produce several harvests a year. Farmers raised seedlings on rafts of mud and weed, then cut the mat into squares and transplanted each square into the field, so that the plot was never empty. The yields were extraordinary. Estimates suggest that a single hectare of chinampa could feed something like 15 to 20 people year-round in a world where ordinary rain-fed maize farming on the hillsides might feed 3 or 4. That difference is the whole story of how a city of 200,000 people could exist in a mountain valley without draft animals or wheeled transport. Everything moved by canoe on the canals, and the canals were the byproduct of making the fields. Around the growing fields they extended the island itself, using the same method, so that Tenochtitlan crept outward year by year into the lake, mud basket by mud basket. Where the water was too deep they drove piles. Where a building would be heavy they laid a raft of cedar timber under the foundation to spread the load. And even so the great structures sank and had to be rebuilt higher, one shell over another, so that the main temple was eventually 7 temples nested inside each other, like the layers of an onion, each burying the last. That sinking never stopped. It has not stopped now. When the Spanish drained the lakes and built their own capital on the site, they inherited the problem and made it worse. And the Cathedral of Mexico City has been slowly settling into the old lake bed for 4 centuries, its floors visibly tilted, its towers braced and shimmed and jacked by engineers in every generation. In the first decades there were no palaces and no pyramids. There were reed huts and mud and a small shrine. The Mexica paid tribute to Azcapotzalco, the Tepanec city on the western shore, which had become the dominant power in the valley. And they paid it in fish and frogs and ducks and lake produce, and in military service, which was the part that mattered. They fought Azcapotzalco's wars. They were good at it. They were paid in scraps of land and in permission to exist. Within a few years of the founding, a second group split off and settled the northern part of the island under their own leadership, founding Tlatelolco, which for a long time was a rival and later became the great market district of the joined city. The split may have been a quarrel over authority. It may have been deliberate, a way of hedging. The 2 settlements grew toward each other until the buildings met, and the island was one city with 2 hearts. The Mexica had no king in the beginning. They were led by their god-bearers, by priests and war leaders. But they were living now among peoples who all had kings, and there was a hierarchy of prestige in the valley that mattered enormously in practice. A city with a legitimate ruler, descended from Toltec nobility, could make alliances and marriages that a city led by a council of upstarts could not. So they went back to Culhuacan, the very city they had fled, and asked for a prince. It says a great deal about them that they were able to do this at all, and more that it worked. Enough time had passed, enough marriages had happened, enough Mexica warriors had proved useful. Culhuacan sent them a young nobleman named Acamapichtli, handful of reeds, whose father was Mexica and whose mother was a Culhua princess. In about 1375, he was seated as the first Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan. That word is worth pausing on. Tlatoani means he who speaks. Not the one who owns, not the one who commands, but the one who speaks. The voice of the city. The plural is Tlatoc. A Tlatoani was chosen from among the eligible men of the royal lineage by a council of nobles and priests and senior warriors, not automatically inherited by the eldest son. And brothers succeeded brothers, as often as sons succeeded fathers. That mattered later, at the very end, when the Mexica needed to replace a dead ruler quickly in the middle of a siege. And could. Acamapichtli reigned for about 20 years. He was married, by careful design, to daughters of the leading families of every district of the island, so that his children carried the blood of all of them, and the royal house was tied to everyone at once. He built the first stone buildings. He dredged canals. He organized the city into kalpuli, the neighborhood units that held land in common, ran their own schools and temples, and mustered their own warriors. And he served Azcapotzalco loyally, sending tribute and fighting where he was told, and Tenochtitlan grew quietly under that service the way a plant grows under a stone. His son Huitzilihuitl, Hummingbird Feather, came next, and did the single most consequential thing available to a small power surrounded by large ones. He married upward. He asked for and received a daughter of the aged Tepanec Emperor of Azcapotzalco himself, and in return the tribute burden on Tenochtitlan was reduced almost to a token, a symbolic offering of ducks and fish and lake plants. He also married a princess from Cuernavaca, in the warm country south of the mountains, where cotton grew. Until then, the Mexica had worn coarse cloth of maggy fiber, the scratchy stuff of the poor. Cotton came into the city with that marriage, and with it the beginnings of real trade and real display. The third ruler, Chimalpopoca, Smoking Shield, was a grandson of the Tepanec Emperor through his mother, and under him Tenochtitlan built its first aqueduct, bringing fresh water from the springs at Chapultepec, across the lake in a channel of stone and clay, because the lake water around the island was too salty to drink. The city was becoming something. And then the old emperor of Azcapotzalco died in about 1426, and a hard son named Maxtla took the throne by pushing his brother aside and looked across the water at the Mexica with a very cold eye. Maxtla understood the danger better than his father had. Tenochtitlan was a vassal city, but it was a vassal city with a growing army, a royal house married into his own, an aqueduct, a market, and a population that had roughly tripled in 2 generations. Texcoco on the eastern shore had its own ambitious young prince. Azcapotzalco ruled the valley by threat and by tribute, and threats need refreshing. So Maxtla cut the aqueduct. He raised the tribute back to a crushing level. He humiliated Mexica envoys, and Chimalpopoca, the Mexica ruler, died, either murdered on Maxtla's orders or, in one version, taking his own life in a cage in Azcapotzalco while awaiting execution. Around the same time, the ruler of Texcoco was killed, and his son, a young man named Nezahualcoyotl, Fasting Coyote, fled into the mountains with a price on his head and spent years as a fugitive, hiding in caves, sheltered by peasants, hunted by Tepanec soldiers. Tenochtitlan met in council in a mood close to panic. The nobles were divided. A large faction wanted to submit to carry the city's god out to Azcapotzalco and lay him at Maxtla's feet and accept whatever terms were offered, because the alternative was annihilation. They were not cowards. They were counting. Azcapotzalco could put many times their numbers in the field. The man who won the argument was not the new ruler. He was the ruler's nephew, a priest and war captain named Tlacaelel. and he is one of the strangest and most important figures in the whole history of the Americas, precisely because he never took the throne and never wanted it. The council chose Itzcoatl, Obsidian Serpent, as Tlatoani. He was an older man, a son of the first ruler Acama Pichtli by a common woman, a slave in some accounts, which meant he had come up through merit and war rather than through the purest line. Tlacaelel offered him a bargain in front of the assembly. "Let the warriors go out and fight," he said. "If we lose, we will hand ourselves over to the Tepanecs to be eaten. If we win, the nobles must give the warriors land and titles and a share of everything taken." The commoners of the city, in the same story, made the opposite offer to the nobles. "If you win, we will serve you. We will carry your burdens. We will build your houses and work your fields forever. If you lose, we will eat you off broken dishes." Whether or not those speeches were ever made in those words, something like that contract was struck, and it defined Aztec society afterward. War would be the engine of social mobility. A commoner who took captives could rise. A noble who did not fight was nothing, and the state that came out the other side of this war would be structured around the permanent necessity of more war. They sent to Texcoco and to the fugitive prince Nezahualcoyotl, who had allies of his own. They sent to Tlacan, a smaller Tepanec town on the western shore, whose lord had his own grievances against Maxtla, and in about 1428 they attacked Azcapotzalco. The siege lasted, in the accounts, 114 days. When the city fell, it was sacked and burned, and its people were sold into slavery, and its great market was moved, and the name of the Tepanec Empire ended. Maxtla was killed, or fled and was hunted down, depending on the source. The Mexica warriors who had made the bargain came home with land, and a new noble class was created out of them almost overnight. Out of the wreckage came the arrangement that would rule central Mexico for the next 90 years. Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan formed what we call the Triple Alliance, an agreement to campaign together and to divide the spoils. Tribute from conquered towns was split, 2/5 to Tenochtitlan, 2/5 to Texcoco, 1/5 to Tlacopan. In the beginning it was a partnership of near equals. Within 50 years it was a Mexica empire with 2 junior partners, and by the end, Tlacopan was little more than an honored spectator. Notice what this empire was and was not. It did not, as a rule, occupy the territories it defeated. It did not install governors everywhere or garrison every town, or impose its language by decree, or replace local rulers. Its usual practice was to defeat a city, kill or terrify enough of its leadership to make the point, install or confirm a ruler who would cooperate, take royal daughters as wives to bind the houses together, and then set a tribute schedule and go home. The defeated city kept its gods, its customs, its internal law, and its dynasty. What it lost was independence in foreign policy and a fixed share of everything it produced forever. That is a cheap empire to run. It is also a fragile one. Every subject city retains its own identity, its own army, its own resentments, and its own memory of the day the Mexica came. When a crisis arrives, there is nothing holding the structure together except the belief that resistance is hopeless. We will see what happens when that belief cracks. Tlacaelel, meanwhile, took a title that translates roughly as woman snake, an ancient priestly office that had become the second highest position in the state, something between a prime minister, a chief justice, and a high priest. He held it for something like 60 years, under 4 successive rulers, all of whom were his relatives, and he was offered the throne at least once and refused it. He seems to have understood that the person who shapes what a society believes has more durable power than the person who sits on the mat. And what he did with that power was to rewrite the past. Shortly after the victory over Azcapotzalco, Itzcoatl and Tlacaelel ordered the painted books of the valley collected and burned. Mesoamerican books were screen folds of bark paper or deerskin, coated with lime plaster and painted in bright pigments, folded like an accordion, read by trained interpreters who knew the conventions and could expand a page of images into hours of recitation. They held genealogies, tribute lists, ritual calendars, histories, maps. The old books said, among other things, that the Mexica had been nobodies, wandering scavengers, mercenaries hired and dismissed, servants of Culhuacan, vassals of the Tepanecs, squatters on a mudbank. The chronicle records the justification with startling frankness. It was not fitting, the account says, that all the people should know the paintings, because many in them were lies, and many had been made gods who were not. New histories were painted. In them the Mexica were the chosen people of Huitzilopochtli. From the beginning, their migration a sacred journey, their god the equal of the greatest deities of Mesoamerica, and their empire the necessary instrument by which the sun was kept alive. The story of the eagle and the cactus was elevated into a founding revelation. Rival versions vanished. This is why the history you have been listening to has soft edges in place. Almost everything the Mexica said about their own origins passed through the hands of a man whose deliberate policy was to make it useful, rather than accurate, and then passed again through the hands of Spanish friars and mestizo chroniclers, writing decades after the conquest for European readers, in a world where the old religion was a capital offense. Archaeology has confirmed a great deal of it and quietly corrected some. Where I am confident, I have told you plainly. Where the ground is soft, I will tell you that too. The other half of Tlacaelel's project was theological, and it is the half that has made the Aztecs notorious. The Mexica inherited from the whole of Mesoamerica the belief that the world had been created and destroyed several times. In their version, there had been 4 previous suns, 4 ages, each with its own humanity and its own catastrophe. The first sun was destroyed when jaguars ate the people. The second was blown apart by wind, and the survivors became monkeys. The third was destroyed by a rain of fire. The fourth was drowned in a flood, and its people became fish. Each of these ages had ended, and the 5th age, the one they lived in, was called 4 movement, and it would end in earthquakes, and it too would end. That was not in question. The only question was when. At Teotihuacan, in the darkness before the 5th sun, the gods had gathered around a fire and asked which of them would throw himself into it to become the new sun. A proud, wealthy god hesitated at the edge, 4 times, feeling the heat. A small, sick, humble god, covered in sores, ran forward and jumped without pausing and rose into the sky as the sun. The proud one, shamed, jumped after him and became the moon, and was dimmed by a rabbit thrown into his face, which is why the Mexica saw a rabbit in the full moon and not a man. But the new sun did not move. It hung in the sky, motionless, burning, and so all the other gods offered themselves and were killed, one after another, and only then did the sun begin its journey across the heavens. The sun moves because gods died to make it move. That is the founding premise. Existence is not free, and it is not owed to anyone, and it was purchased at a price that must be repaid. Every human being is alive on borrowed energy. The Nahuatl word for the sacred essence that flows through blood, sunlight, and living things is often rendered as Teotl. It circulates. It runs down and must be renewed. Human sacrifice existed in Mesoamerica for at least 2,000 years before the Mexica. The Maya did it. The Zapotecs did it. Teotihuacan did it. And archaeologists have found the bound skeletons of warriors buried in rows beneath its pyramid. It was not a Mexica invention. What Tlacaelel appears to have done, and what the sources credit him with, was to place it at the absolute center of the state, to industrialize it, and to make the feeding of the sun the explicit purpose of empire. He is also credited with the institution called the Flower War. This was a formal, pre-arranged battle, fought at agreed times on agreed ground, between the Triple Alliance and certain rival states, above all Tlaxcala to the east and its neighbors. The stated purpose was not conquest. It was the taking of live captives by both sides, for sacrifice by both sides, and the training of young warriors, and the display of courage. Warriors did not aim to kill in these battles. They aimed to wound, to grapple, to drag a man off the field alive, because a dead enemy was worth nothing and a living one was worth everything. Historians have argued about the Flower Wars for a century. Some take the religious explanation at face value. Others point out that Tlaxcala was never conquered despite being surrounded and militarily weaker, and suggest that the Flower Wars were a long strangulation, a way of bleeding an enemy slowly while keeping a convenient supply of sacrificial victims nearby, and that the ritual framing was partly cover for a failure to finish the job. Both may be true at once. Human institutions are usually doing several things at the same time. What matters for the story ahead is this. Tlaxcala, a few days' walk east of the lake, spent generations watching its young men march to the top of the great temple. It was surrounded by Aztec territory, cut off from salt and cotton, poor and proud and permanently at war, and it never forgot. Its coatl died in about 1440, having ruled 13 years and having changed everything. The city he handed on was no longer a client. It had a stone temple, a causeway to the mainland, tribute flowing in from the near towns, a warrior aristocracy hungry for more, and a state religion that made expansion a sacred duty. The council chose his nephew, and it is with this man that the empire proper begins. His name was Moctezuma Ilhuicamina, and the second part of that name means he who shoots arrows at the sky, which tells you something about how he was remembered. To avoid confusion with the far more famous ruler of the same name who came 3 generations later, historians call him Moctezuma I. The name itself in Nahuatl means roughly he who frowns like a lord or the angry lord. English has spelled it Montezuma for 4 centuries out of habit and a Spanish ear. He ruled for about 29 years, from 1440 to 1469. And under him, Tenochtitlan stopped being a strong city in a valley and became the head of an empire that reached the sea. His armies went east first, over the mountains into the hot country, and took the Gulf Coast lowlands, the land of the Aztec and the Totonac, where cotton grew thick and cacao could be traded and the air was heavy and wet and full of insects, and the highland soldiers sweated in a way they had never sweated at home. They went south into the country of the Mixtec and toward Oaxaca, where a garrison town was planted at a mountain pass to keep the road open. They pushed against Chalco in the southern valley in a war that dragged on for decades, because Chalco was close and stubborn and its defeat was personal. The tribute lists that survive from later reigns give a sense of what flowed back along those roads carried on the backs of porters, because there was no other way to move it. Cotton cloaks by the tens of thousands, loads of raw cotton, cacao beans by the sackful, which were currency as much as food, feathers of the quetzal, long and iridescent green, and of the blue cotinga and the scarlet macaw, packed carefully in cases, jade and turquoise, gold dust in quills, rubber balls for the ball game, live eagles, jaguar skins, amber, copal incense, honey, chilies, salt, bins of maize and beans and amaranth and dried sage seed, loincloths, sandals, war costumes, feathered shields, obsidian blades, paper, lime timber, and in some districts, at fixed intervals, people. None of it came by wheel. The Mesoamericans knew about the wheel. There are small wheeled ceramic figurines in the archaeological record, animals on rollers, clearly toys or ritual objects. But without draft animals, and in mountain country with no roads suitable for carts, the wheel had no application worth developing. Everything went on human backs in a frame carried by a strap across the forehead, or by canoe wherever water allowed, and the empire's logistics were built around the tumplin and the paddle. Halfway through his reign, everything nearly ended. In the year 1450 it began to rain, and it did not stop. Floods came down off the mountains, and the lake rose and swallowed the lower streets of Tenochtitlan and drowned the Chinampas under brackish water. The following years brought frost that killed the maize in the fields, and then drought that killed what the frost had spared, and then locusts. 4 years of failed harvest, from 1450 to 1454, in a valley holding hundreds of thousands of people who had grown accustomed to eating well. The famine that followed is remembered in Nahuatl sources as a horror. The state granaries were opened and emptied. People left the city and walked toward the Gulf Coast, where the rains had not failed, and sold themselves and their children into slavery for maize. The price was fixed in the stories: 400 ears of maize for a girl, 500 for a boy, and traders from the lowlands came up into the valley to buy. Bodies lay in the streets and were carried out on canoes. Vultures grew fat over the causeways. Moctezuma's response tells you what kind of state this was. He opened the stores, which any competent ruler would do. He suspended tribute from the hardest-hit provinces, and he ordered the building of a dike. The dike is one of the great forgotten engineering works of the pre-modern world. Nezahualcoyotl of Texcoco, the fugitive prince who had become a poet-king, is credited with designing it. It ran roughly 10 miles north to south through the lake, a double palisade of piles packed with rubble and clay, wide enough to walk along at the top, with sluice gates that could be opened and closed. Its purpose was to separate the fresh water on the western side, around Tenochtitlan, fed by springs and rivers, from the salty water of the eastern lake, and to stop the storm surges that flooded the island. It worked. The city could grow chinampas in water that would have killed the crops before. He also, at Tlacaelel's urging, turned to the gods, and the famine years are when the machinery of sacrifice appears to have been enlarged and the flower wars formalized. If the rain failed because the gods were unfed, then the answer was more food for the gods. This is not a comfortable logic, but it was internally consistent, and it was believed at every level of society, including by the victims. Then the rains came back in 1455, and the maize grew, and the coincidence confirmed everything. The rest of Moctezuma's reign was consolidation. He rebuilt the great temple larger. He fixed the calendar of festivals. He and Tlacaelel issued a body of law and custom that hardened the class structure into something close to caste. And the details are worth hearing because they show you the texture of daily life better than any battle. Only the ruler could wear a cloak that reached the ankle. Commoners' cloaks stopped at the knee, and the finer the weave and the richer the dye, and the more elaborate the border, the higher the rank permitted to wear it. Cotton was forbidden to commoners entirely in principle, though the rule bent in practice. Gold, jade, turquoise, and quetzal feathers were reserved for nobles and for warriors who had earned the right by taking captives. Only certain ranks could wear sandals in the palace, or drink chocolate, or smoke tobacco tubes after a meal, or build a house with a second story, or have more than one wife. Drunkenness was punished savagely. Pulque, the fermented sap of the magi plant, thick and sour and mildly alcoholic, was permitted freely only to the very old, over about 70, who had earned the right to sit in the sun and drink as much as they liked and be indulgently ignored. Everyone else could drink at specific festivals. A commoner found drunk in public might have his head shaved in the marketplace and his house pulled down. A noble found drunk could be strangled, and a priest almost certainly would be, because the whole system rested on the idea that those with privilege were held to harder standards, not softer ones. Judges who took bribes were executed. So were those who moved boundary markers, sold stolen goods, or wore clothing above their station. There is a phrase that recurs in the Nahuatl moral literature that the friars later collected, the Huehuetlatolli, the speeches of the elders, which parents recited to children and rulers recited at coronation. The good life is described again and again as the middle of the road, moderate, careful, self-controlled. Do not walk too fast, a father tells his son, and do not walk too slowly, for if you walk fast, people will say you are frantic, and if you walk slowly, they will say you are lazy. Do not stare at people. Do not eat greedily. Speak quietly. Do not laugh loudly in the street. Wash yourself. That is not the picture most people carry of the Aztecs. It sits right beside the other picture, the one with the obsidian knife on the temple platform, in the same society, held by the same people, without any apparent sense of contradiction. Human beings are like that everywhere. It is only distance that makes a culture look simple. Moctezuma I died around 1469 and was succeeded by his grandson Axayacatl, Waterface, a young man in his 20s chosen over older candidates by the council, with Tlacaelel still standing behind the throne as he had for 40 years. Axayacatl's reign gave the empire two things, one triumph and one humiliation, and the humiliation mattered more. The triumph came at home. Tlatelolco, the sister city at the northern end of the island, had never entirely accepted second place. It had the greatest market in the Americas, and a wealthy merchant class, and its own royal line, and its ruler Mokiix, whose wife was Axayacatl's sister, was said to have treated her badly, keeping her in a corner room, mocking her, while surrounding himself with concubines. She is supposed to have crossed the city and told her brother. Whether that is true or an excuse dressed as a grievance, in 1473 the two halves of the island fought, and Tlatelolco lost, and Mokiix was thrown or fell from the top of his own temple pyramid. Tlatelolco lost its dynasty and was placed under a military governor. Its market kept running, and its merchants kept their wealth, and its people stayed bitter for the next 50 years. The humiliation came in the west. Beyond the mountains, in what is now Michoacan, around the beautiful lakes of Pátzcuaro, there was a state the Aztecs called the Tarascans, and which called itself Purepecha. It was the only power in Mesoamerica that could match the Triple Alliance, and it was different in almost every way. Its language was unrelated to Nahuatl or to anything else nearby. Its capital, Tzintzuntzan, the place of hummingbirds, was built around great oval platforms rather than square pyramids. Its state was more centralized than the Aztec one, with appointed governors and a standing military frontier, and its people worked metal. That is the point that decides the story. The Purepecha smelted and alloyed copper, and copper with tin, which is bronze, and they made axes and awls and needles and fishhooks and, crucially, weapons. Elsewhere in Mesoamerica, metal was mainly ornament, gold and silver, and copper bells worked cold or cast for display. In Michoacan it was tools and blades. In 1478 or thereabouts, Axayacatl marched west with an enormous army, perhaps 24,000 men in the sources, though those figures should always be treated as impressions rather than counts. He met a Purepecha force that may have been larger, dug in on chosen ground. The Aztecs attacked and were broken. The retreat became a rout. The chronicles say that of the great army that went out, only a fraction came back, and Axayacatl himself was wounded, and returned to Tenochtitlan and stood before the council and had to explain. The Aztec Empire never conquered the Purépecha. It built a chain of fortified towns along the western frontier and held a defensive line there for 40 years, and the two powers glowered at each other across it until the end. It is a useful correction to the idea of an unstoppable Aztec war machine. There were limits, there were enemies who did not lose, and there was, on the western border and the eastern one alike, a permanent drain of men and attention. Axayacatl died young, around 1481, in his early 30s, probably from the wound or from an illness that followed it. Under him, the great stone disc that most people picture when they think of the Aztecs was carved, the huge basalt monolith 12 feet across, weighing 24 tons, with a face at the center, surrounded by the signs of the 4 previous suns and the 20-day names. It is usually called the Sunstone, or wrongly, the Aztec calendar. It is not a calendar you could use. It is a statement about time and about the price of keeping the world alive, and the face at its center may be the sun god, or the earth as a devouring monster, and scholars still argue. It lay buried under the main square of Mexico City for 250 years and was dug up by workmen in 1790, and it is the single most recognizable object of the Americas before Columbus. His brother Tizoc took the throne next, and was, by common agreement even among his own people, a disappointment. Tizoc ruled for about 5 years and did almost nothing well. His first campaign, the customary war a new ruler waged to bring back captives for his own coronation, went badly. He set out against a town in the Toluca Valley and came home with a handful of prisoners, far fewer than the occasion demanded, and the city noticed. In a state where a ruler's legitimacy rested visibly on his ability to feed the temple, that was not a small embarrassment. It was closer to a disqualification. He did commission a magnificent object, a low cylindrical stone of dark basalt, 8 feet across, carved around its rim with 15 scenes of himself in the guise of a god seizing captive warriors by the hair, each captive labeled with the glyph of a conquered town. Many of those towns had been conquered by his predecessors. The stone is a beautiful piece of official lying. It is also, as it happens, a sacrificial stone on which captives were laid, or to which they were tethered in a form of gladiatorial combat, and it survives. And you can look at it in the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City with a cool head and see exactly what it was for. Tizoc died in 1486. The chronicles hint, without stating, that he was poisoned by nobles who had had enough. Nobody mourned him for long. His younger brother, Ahuitzotl, took the mat, and the difference was immediate. Ahuitzotl is named for a mythical water creature, a small furry animal with a hand at the end of its tail that lived in lakes and pulled swimmers under. He was a soldier's ruler, personally present on campaign, unsentimental, restless. Under him the empire reached its greatest size, running from the Gulf Coast in the east to the Pacific in the west, and south along the coast almost to the border of Guatemala, taking in the Soconusco, the hot cacao country beyond Tehuantepec, more than 500 miles from the capital, reached by a march that took months. He also rebuilt the great temple to its final form, and dedicated it in 1487 with a ceremony that has echoed through 5 centuries of argument. The chronicles say the dedication lasted 4 days, that 4 lines of captives stretched from the temple out along the causeways, and that when it was done, somewhere between 20,000 and 80,000 people had been killed on the platform at the top. Ahuitzotl himself took the knife, along with the rulers of Texcoco and Tlacopan and the high priests, working in shifts, and were relieved as their arms gave out. Those numbers cannot be right. Take the highest figure and divide by the hours available, and you get several victims per second, sustained for 4 days, which is not physically possible on a platform with a fixed number of altars and a single staircase. Take the lowest, and it is still an enormous rate. Scholars have proposed everything from a few thousand upward. The chroniclers were working from Mexica accounts that were themselves boasts, then filtered through Spanish writers with reasons of their own to make the numbers as monstrous as possible, since a monstrous native religion justified everything that came after. But the impulse to shrink the number to nothing is also a distortion, and archaeology has been unkind to it. Beneath the modern streets at the foot of the Great Temple, excavators have found the Zompantli, the skull rack, and the Tower of Skulls built beside it, mortared together with lime. Hundreds upon hundreds of them, men and women and children, many showing the cut marks of decapitation and the drilled holes where they were strung on poles. The offering caches under the temple contain the bones of sacrificed children with their teeth still forming. It happened often in public as the ordinary business of the state, and it was understood by the people who did it as the highest act of piety available to a human being. Try for a moment to stand inside it rather than outside. The sun is not a fact. It is a struggle. Every night it goes down into the underworld and fights, and every dawn it comes back up. And it is carried for the souls of warriors who died in battle or on the stone, who accompany it from the horizon to the zenith with shouts and the beating of shields, and by the souls of women who died in childbirth, who are honored as warriors too, and carry it from the zenith down to the west. Those souls have the best afterlife there is. Everyone else goes to Mictlan, the place of the dead, a long gray descent of 4 years through 9 levels. Past a river you cross on the back of a red dog, past clashing mountains and a wind full of obsidian blades, to arrive at last at a quiet nothing. So a captive on the stone is not, in this system, simply a victim. He is being sent, in a public and honorable capacity, into the retinue of the sun. Some accounts describe captives going up the steps willingly. Some describe them having to be dragged, and both are surely true of different men. The warrior who took him addressed him as beloved son. The captive addressed his captor as beloved father. And the captor did not eat the flesh of his own captive in the ritual meal that followed, because that would have been eating his own son. You do not have to accept any of this. You are allowed to find it appalling. But it was a theology, not a hobby. And the people who practiced it were farmers and weavers and mothers and poets who also washed twice a day, kept immaculate cities, wept at their children's illnesses, and wrote some of the most melancholy verse in the pre-modern world. Ahuitzottl's other great work nearly destroyed the city. Tenochtitlan had outgrown the aqueduct from Chapultepec, so he ordered a new one from the springs at Coyoacan to the south, which produced far more water. His engineers and the lord of Coyoacan warned him that the spring was too strong, that it would overwhelm the channel and the island. The story says the lord kept objecting and that Ahuitzotl had him killed for it, which, if true, is the kind of decision that gets remembered for a reason. The aqueduct was built. The water came. It came in such volume that in 1499 the lake rose and Tenochtitlan flooded, canals bursting their banks, houses collapsing, whole districts underwater, and people fleeing to the rooftops and the mainland. It took years to repair, with Nezahualpilli of Texcoco, son of the poet king, brought in to redesign the works. The city was rebuilt more grandly than before, which is the usual answer to a disaster in a wealthy state. Ahuitzotl died in 1502. One tradition says he struck his head on a stone lintel while escaping the floodwaters and never recovered. He had ruled 16 years and left an empire of perhaps 5 to 6 million people, drawing tribute from something like 400 towns, with a capital that had no rival in the hemisphere. The council met to choose his successor, as it always did. Among the candidates were sons and nephews of the previous rulers, war leaders with reputations, men with followings. They chose a nephew of Ahuitzotl, a son of Axayacatl, a man in his early 30s who had already commanded armies, but who was known above all as a priest, austere, precise, deeply learned in ritual, unusually reserved. His name was Moctezuma Xocoyotzin. The last word means the younger, to distinguish him from his great-grandfather. He would rule for 17 years, and he would be the last Tlatoani of an independent Tenochtitlan, and history has been arguing about him ever since. Before we follow him, though, let us walk through the city while it is still whole, because in 17 years it will be gone, and it deserves to be seen. Come at it from the south along the causeway from Iztapalapa in the early morning, which is the way the Spanish first saw it and the way it made the strongest impression. The causeway is a raised road of packed earth faced with stone, wide enough for 8 horsemen to ride abreast, running straight out across open water for several miles. On either side the lake stretches away, shallow and silver, dotted with canoes. There are gaps in the causeway at intervals, spanned by removable wooden bridges which allow the water to flow and the canoe traffic to pass, and which can be lifted in an emergency, a detail that will matter terribly later. Towns stand out in the water, on their own islands and promontories, with white towers, and the whole scene at dawn has a floating quality, buildings rising out of mist with nothing visible holding them up. Where the causeway meets the island, there is a fortified gatehouse with towers on either side. Beyond it, the city begins. It is laid out on a grid. 4 great districts radiate from the ceremonial center, each subdivided into kalpuli, neighborhood wards of a few thousand people, each with its own small temple, its own school, its own local officials, its own patch of communal land. The streets alternate. There is a paved street, then a canal, then a paved street, then a canal, so that a house can receive goods by land or by water, and a great deal of movement happens on the water. Canoes are everywhere, flat-bottomed and poled, carrying maize, flowers, firewood, building stone, pottery, passengers, garbage, night soil. The buildings are of adobe brick faced with plaster, or, for the wealthy, of volcanic stone, and they are washed white with lime and shine. Roofs are flat and used as terraces, with pots of flowers on them and awnings. Windows are few and small. Houses face inward onto a courtyard, so that the street presents mostly a blank white wall with a doorway, and the life of the household is invisible from outside. On the outer edges of the city, the houses give way to chinampa plots, and there the pattern is a long green field, a strip of water, a long green field with a small house at the end of each, and willows at the corners, and maize and beans and chilies and tomatoes and amaranth and squash and marigolds growing in dense rows. There is no sewage in the streets. This bears saying because European cities of the period were, by every account, including their own, disgusting. Tenochtitlan had public latrines at intervals along the causeways and canals, and canoes that collected waste for use as fertilizer. And 1,000 men, by one Spanish estimate, who did nothing but sweep and wash the streets and the public spaces every day. Urine was collected in pots and sold to dyers, who used it as a mordant to fix color in cloth. Nothing was thrown away that had a use. Bathing was daily, sometimes twice daily, in the canals or with water poured from a jar. There were also steam baths called temazcali, low-domed chambers of stone and plaster, where water was thrown on heated rocks, and the bather sweated in the dark and was switched with bundles of grass, then cooled. It was used for cleanliness, for medicine, for childbirth recovery, and for ritual purification. The Spanish, who at the time associated frequent bathing with heresy and ill health, found the custom baffling and eventually banned it. Fresh water came in on the aqueduct from Chapultepec, running along the western causeway in two channels of stone and clay, so that one could carry water while the other was cleaned. At the city end it fed fountains and storage basins, and from there water sellers filled jars and poled them through the canals, calling their trade, delivering to doorways. The center of the island is the sacred precinct, a walled square perhaps 400 meters on a side, containing dozens of structures. The wall is low and topped with carved stone serpent heads, which is why it is called the Coatepantli, the serpent wall. Inside there is a plaza large enough, the Spanish said, for 8,000 or 10,000 people to dance in, and at the eastern side of the plaza stands the great temple. It is a stepped pyramid of stone rubble, faced with dressed stone and covered in white plaster. Roughly 180 feet high in its final form, with a broad double staircase running up the western face. At the top there are two shrines, side by side, painted and roofed, each fronted by a sacrificial stone. The southern shrine belongs to Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird god of sun and war, and it is painted red and white. The northern shrine belongs to Tlaloc, the ancient rain god, older by far than the Mexica, whose face is made of two coiled serpents forming goggles and a mustache of fangs, and it is painted blue and white. That pairing is the entire Aztec worldview in one building. War and rain, the sun that must be fed and the water that must be begged for. Conquest and agriculture, the two things on which a city in a high, dry valley depends. The pyramid is understood to be Coatepec, the Serpent Mountain, where Huitzilopochtli was born and threw down his sister. At the foot of the southern staircase, there is an enormous circular stone carved with the dismembered body of Coyolxauhqui, the moon goddess, head and limbs severed, bells on her cheeks, so that a body rolling down the temple steps arrives on top of her image, and the myth is reenacted physically, in stone and blood, in front of the whole city. That stone was found in 1978 by electrical workers digging a trench behind the cathedral, which is how the modern excavation of the Templo Mayor began. Everything we know from the ground about the temple comes from work that started with an accident less than 50 years ago. Around the Great Pyramid stand the rest of the precinct, a round temple to Quetzalcoatl in his form as the wind god, round because wind has no corners and moves freely. The ball court sunken and eye-shaped, with stone rings set high in the side walls. The skull rack, a wooden scaffold strung with thousands of skulls facing outward, and beside it the towers of skulls set in mortar. Priests' quarters. 2 Kamakak, the schools for noble youths. Storehouses for ritual costumes. A pool for ritual washing. Braziers burning day and night. And there is the sound. Consider what the city sounded like, because it is not a sound anyone alive has heard. No wheels, no hooves, no metal on stone except the soft tap of copper. Instead, the constant undertone of water moving in canals and paddles dipping. Human voices in enormous number. The slap of hands shaping tortillas from every household, beginning before dawn and continuing for hours. A sound travelers everywhere in Mexico described for centuries afterward. The grinding of maize on stone metates. Bare feet, sandals, from the temple at intervals through the day and night, the deep boom of a great drum with a snakeskin head, and the harsh long note of a conch shell trumpet, and the whistle of clay flutes, marking the watches so that the whole city knew the hour. North of the sacred precinct at Tlatelolco is the market. The Spanish soldiers who saw it had been to Constantinople and to Rome and to Seville, and they wrote that they had never seen anything like it, that some of them who had traveled in Italy said no market in the world was so large or so orderly or so full of people. The estimates given are 60,000 people on the main day, 20,000 on ordinary days. Even if we cut those figures in half, they remain astonishing. It was arranged by street, every commodity in its own quarter, so that a buyer knew exactly where to go and prices could be compared. Gold, silver, and precious stones in one section, feathers in another, sorted by bird and length and color, cloth, cotton thread dyed in every shade, sandals, ropes and cordage of Magi fiber, timber, planks, beams, and firewood in bundles, building stone, lime, charcoal, clay pots and comals and jars, thousands of them, stacked in rows, obsidian blades struck fresh from cores by knappers working in front of the customer, sharper at the edge than any steel scalpel and useless after a dozen cuts, so that they were bought like matches. Then the food, maize in many varieties and colors, beans, squash and their seeds, amaranth, chia, tomatoes green and red, chilies of every heat and shape, fresh and dried and smoked, avocados, cactus fruit and cactus paddles, sweet potatoes, vanilla pods, honey from bees and syrup from the Magi, cacao beans in sacks, turkeys alive and dressed, small hairless dogs raised for meat, deer and rabbit and hare, ducks and quail and geese, fish from the lake, frogs, salamanders, insect eggs skimmed from the water and pressed into cakes, grasshoppers roasted with salt and chili, blue-green algae cut into bricks, tamales of 100 kinds, and cooked food sold hot for those who did not want to cook, which in a city that size was a great many people. There were sections for medicines, herbs and roots and ointments and bark, with sellers who would diagnose you on the spot. There were barbers who cut hair with obsidian. There were porters for hire. There were sellers of slaves who stood in wooden collars and could be examined, though slavery among the Mexica was not the chattel slavery of the Atlantic world. A slave could own property, could marry a free person, could own slaves, and their children were born free. People entered slavery through debt, through gambling losses, through crime, or by selling themselves in famine, and could buy their way out. Everything was inspected. There was a court of 12 judges sitting permanently in the market to settle disputes on the spot, and officers walking the aisles checking measures. A merchant caught using a short measure had it broken publicly and could be beaten or expelled. Prices were not fixed by the state, but haggling was constrained by custom and by the presence of everyone else selling the same thing 10 paces away. Money existed in a soft form. Cacao beans were the small change of the empire, counted in units of 8,000 for large transactions, and people counterfeited them by filling emptied husks with mud, which is a very human detail. Cotton cloaks of standard size and quality, called quachtli, were the larger denomination, and there were rough equivalences, a canoe worth so many cloaks, a day's labor worth so many beans. Quills of gold dust were used for the largest sums, but there was no coinage, no mint, no state currency, and a great deal of the economy ran on tribute, obligation, and gift rather than sale. And moving through all of it, in their own guild with their own gods and their own courts, were the Pochteca, the long-distance merchants who deserved their own moment. The Pochteca were merchants, spies, diplomats, and occasionally soldiers, and they occupied a position in Aztec society that had no clean equivalent anywhere else. They were commoners by birth. They could not become nobles, and they were forbidden to display their wealth openly, and they knew it. But they were rich, sometimes richer than nobles, and they had their own hereditary guild, their own patron god, their own quarters in the city, their own law courts which the state did not interfere with, and the ability to punish their own members, including by death. They traveled in armed caravans, months at a time, out beyond the frontier of the empire, into lands that owed the Mexica nothing, into Maya country, and down to the borders of what is now Guatemala. They carried obsidian blades, copper bells, cochineal dye, rabbit fur cloth, herbs, and needles, and they came back with quetzal feathers, jade, jaguar pelts, cacao, amber, and the shells of sea turtles. They spoke the languages of the places they visited. They dressed as locals when it was safer to do so, and they reported everything they saw to the ruler when they returned, which is why a trading expedition and a reconnaissance mission were, in practice, the same journey. If a caravan was attacked, that was a legal cause for war, and the empire used it as such repeatedly. Send merchants into an independent province. Wait. When they are robbed or killed, and eventually they will be, demand impossible restitution. When it is refused, march. The province of Soconusco, the cacao-rich coast far to the south, was brought into the empire by exactly this sequence. The homecoming of a pock-taker caravan was a strange, furtive thing. They timed their arrival for the middle of the night. They came in by canoe through back canals to the house of a relative, not their own, and unloaded in the dark, and let it be said publicly that the goods belonged to someone else. Then, when they gave a feast, which they were obliged to do, they gave it lavishly and apologized throughout for its poverty. That performance of humility was the price of being tolerated. Nobles who resented merchant wealth were dangerous, and the pock-taker had seen what happened to men who forgot their station. Ahuitzotl, notably, valued them and raised some to honorable rank. Others resented them intensely. Below and alongside them were the craftsmen, and the finest of these had their own privileged status too. The feather workers, the Amanteka, were the most celebrated. They worked with iridescent feathers from tropical birds, sorting them by size and hue, gluing them in overlapping layers onto a backing of Maggie paper and cotton, to make headdresses, shields, fans, and cloaks that changed color as they moved. The technique was insanely painstaking. Barbs were trimmed with obsidian. Some pieces used tens of thousands of individual feathers. Almost nothing survives because feathers rot, but a handful of objects made it to Europe as curiosities and sit in museums in Vienna and elsewhere, and even faded they are astonishing. The goldsmiths worked by lost wax casting, modeling in beeswax over a clay core, encasing the model, melting out the wax, pouring the metal and breaking the mold. They made bells that rang in clusters at the ankle, lip plugs, ear spools, pendants of gods and animals, filigree so fine that European goldsmiths who saw it in Spain in 1520 said openly that they could not have made it. Albrecht Dürer, the German artist, saw the first shipment of Aztec treasure when it was exhibited in Brussels, and wrote in his diary that in all the days of his life he had seen nothing that so rejoiced his heart, and that he marveled at the subtle ingenuity of the men in those distant lands. Almost all of it was melted down within a few years. It was gold, and Spain needed gold, and shape was an obstacle to spending. What survives of Aztec goldwork is a few dozen pieces, most of them recovered from tombs or from the lake bottom. Stone carvers worked basalt and andesite with harder stone hammers and abrasives, no metal chisels at all, and produced sculpture of terrifying assurance. Lapidaries drilled jade with a reed and wet sand and infinite patience. Potters threw nothing because there was no wheel, but coiled and molded and burnished. Scribes and painters made the books, mixing pigments from minerals and insects and plants, laying them on lime-coated bark paper. Underneath the specialists was everybody else, the Masiwilton, the commoners, the great body of the people, who farmed, fished, carried, built, and fought. A commoner belonged to a Kalpuli, and this was the fundamental unit of ordinary life. The word means something like great house. The Kalpuli held land in common and allotted plots to member households, which farmed them and could pass them to their children, but could not sell them and would lose them, if they left them uncultivated for 2 years. It had its own temple and its own school. It provided a military unit with its own banner and its own standard bearer, so that men fought beside their neighbors. It collected the tribute that its members owed and delivered it as a block. It had elders who arbitrated disputes and a headman who represented it to the city. Above the commoners were the pipiltin, the nobility, descended from rulers, who did not hold land through a calpulli, but owned estates worked by tenants, who were entitled to education in the Kalmikak, and who filled the priesthood, the judiciary, and the high military commands. Below the commoners were the Mayek, landless laborers bound to noble estates, and below them the Tlacatin, the slaves. But the whole thing was less rigid than that list makes it sound. Because of war, a commoner who took captives in battle rose visibly, step by step, and everyone could see the steps because they were worn. One captive earned a particular cloak and the right to a particular hairstyle. 2 captives earned another. At 4 captives, a man could enter the ranks of the veteran orders, the eagles and the jaguars, and wear the feathered suit or the pelt, and eat in the palace, and drink chocolate, and take a second wife, and be exempt from tribute. Above that, at very high counts, a commoner could reach a rank called quopili, an eagle noble, which was nobility earned by the sword, though his children did not inherit it fully. Conversely, a young noble who reached maturity without taking a captive was shamed. His head was shaved in the style of a boy. He could not wear cotton or ornament. He was mocked openly. There are speeches recorded that fathers gave to sons, telling them plainly that the only honorable death was on the battlefield or on the stone of an enemy, and that a man who died at home in his bed of old age had in some sense failed. This is a society with a permanent structural need for war, and it built its child rearing around producing people who wanted it. A child born in Tenochtitlan was washed by a midwife who spoke to it. If it was a boy, she said that he had come into the world to be a warrior, that his home was not here but out there in the field, that his business was to give the sun the blood of enemies. His umbilical cord was given to a warrior to bury on a battlefield. If it was a girl, she said that her place was in the house, by the hearth, at the grinding stone, and her cord was buried beside the hearth itself. She was told, too, that childbirth was her battle, and that a woman who died in it died as a warrior does, and would carry the sun down the western half of the sky, and her body was fiercely guarded after death, because warriors tried to steal the fingers and hair of such women as war charms. Then a diviner was consulted about the day sign of the birth, because in the 260-day ritual calendar every day carried a character, and a child born on a bad day was in trouble from the start. But a bad sign could be softened by delaying the naming ceremony until a better day arrived, which is a nicely practical loophole in a deterministic system. Children were raised strictly and, by the standards of most pre-modern societies, thoughtfully. The Codex Mendoza, a manuscript painted for a Spanish viceroy about 20 years after the conquest by native artists working from memory and older books, contains page after page of childhood laid out year by year, with the exact number of tortillas a child of each age was permitted drawn beside them. At 3, half a tortilla. At 4, 1. At 5, 1.5. Boys of 5 carry firewood and small loads. Girls of 5 hold a spindle. At 6, they are in the market picking up spilled maize. At 7, the boy learns to fish with a net. At 8, punishment appears, and the punishments are drawn plainly. A child is threatened with maggie spines. At 9, the spines are used, driven into the hands or the ears. At 11, a child is held over a fire of chilies and made to breathe the smoke. At 12, a boy is tied and left lying on wet ground for a day. That is severe. It is also, notably, recorded as a graduated system with warnings before punishments, and the accompanying texts spend far more time on speech than on beating. Aztec parents talk to their children constantly, in long, formal admonitions. And those speeches survive because the friars found them so morally admirable that they collected them. Listen to a father speaking to his daughter, in the version Bernardino de Sahagun's informants gave him. He tells her that life on earth is not a place of contentment, that it is a place of weeping and of weariness, where the wind is sharp and cold. And then he tells her to be careful of her appearance, not to paint her face grotesquely, not to walk with her head down or with it thrown back, to look at people directly but not boldly, to speak evenly, and above all not to lie, because a lie is a thing that spreads. At about 15, formal schooling began, and the Mexica had something close to universal education, which was rare anywhere in the world at that date. Noble boys and a few exceptional commoners went to the Comicac, attached to a temple. It was harsh. They rose at night to sweep and to burn incense at fixed hours. They fasted. They bathed in cold water. Before dawn, they drew their own blood with maggie spines and stingray spines through the ears, tongue, and thighs as an offering. They learned to read the painted books, the calendar, astronomy, law, rhetoric, the sacred songs, and the Huitlatoli. They memorized enormous quantities of poetry and oratory. From the Comicac came priests, judges, ambassadors, and the highest commanders. Commoner boys went to the Telpocali, the house of youth, one in each Calpulli. There the emphasis was on physical training, weapons, discipline, and public works, and the boys were also expected to sing and dance every evening at the Cuicacali, the house of song, alongside the girls of the district under supervision, which was the main courtship structure of Aztec society, and was watched closely. Girls' education was mostly domestic and religious. At home and in temple service, learning weaving above all, since cloth was currency, tribute, and the primary product of female labor. Some women served as priestesses. Some became midwives and healers, professions with real authority. Some, particularly among the nobility, were educated in reading and song. Marriage came around 20 for men, and a few years younger for women, arranged by families through elderly female go-betweens who were expected to refuse politely twice before accepting. The bride was carried to the groom's house on the back of the matchmaker at nightfall, in a torchlit procession. The couple's cloaks were literally tied together in a knot, which is where a common Spanish phrase for getting married comes from in Mexico to this day. There were 4 days of fasting and prayer before the marriage was consummated. Divorce existed and was granted by a court on grounds of cruelty, failure to support, or infertility. With property divided and children assigned, boys usually to the father and girls to the mother. A divorced woman could remarry. Adultery, however, was punished by death for both parties, and the sentence was carried out publicly by stoning or by crushing the head. And there are recorded cases of it being applied to the highest nobility, including one that will matter to our story. Let us stay in the house a little longer, because the ordinary hours of an Aztec day are more soothing than the temple and just as revealing. The household woke before dawn. Someone, almost always a woman, had already put the maize on to soak the night before in water with lime or wood ash, a process called nixtamalization, which softens the hull and, though nobody then knew the chemistry, unlocks the niacin in the grain and makes the amino acids available. Maize eaten without it causes pellagra, a disease that later devastated parts of Europe and the American South when maize was adopted without the technique. Mesoamerican cooks had been doing it for 3,000 years. The softened maize was ground on a meatit, a sloping stone slab, with a stone roller, kneeling, pushing forward with the whole upper body. over and over. It is hard physical work, and it took hours every day in every household in the empire. From the dough came tortillas, patted between the palms with that slapping rhythm and cooked on a clay griddle over the fire, and tamales dough steamed in maize husks with fillings of beans, chilies, meat, fish, insects, fruit, or nothing at all. Breakfast for a working man was often atole, a warm maize gruel, sometimes with chili or honey. The main meal came in the middle of the day, in the heat, after which people rested. Supper was light. Meat was uncommon in ordinary households, and animal protein came mostly from the lake, fish and frogs and waterfowl and insect eggs and algae, plus the occasional turkey or dog for a feast. The foundation of the diet was maize, beans, squash, chilies, and amaranth. And it is worth noting that maize and beans eaten together supply a complete protein, which is why this combination underpins Mexican cooking still. Add tomatoes, avocados, cactus, sweet potato, vanilla, peanuts, and turkey, and you have a list of foods that would go on to change every cuisine on Earth. Almost nothing in Italian cooking, or Indian, or Thai, or Hungarian, or West African cooking looks the way it does today without the plants of Mesoamerica and the Andes. And then there is chocolate. Cacao grew in the hot lowlands and had to be brought up to the valley by porters. The beans were fermented, dried, roasted, ground on a metate, and mixed with water, chili, vanilla, achiote, honey, or ground maize. It was drunk cold, not hot, and it was frothed, poured from one vessel to another from a height until it raised a thick foam. And the foam was the best part, taken first. It was bitter, savory, and strong. It was drunk by nobles, by warriors, by merchants, and by priests. And it was forbidden, or at least discouraged for commoners. And it was used in ritual, and given as a gift. The Spanish who first tasted it mostly hated it. Then someone added cane sugar, and the world changed. Medicine in Tenochtitlan was a serious profession with a large and effective pharmacopoeia. Healers, the Tysitl, could be men or women, and they combined herbalism, bone-setting, surgery, and ritual, and there is no evidence they saw a contradiction. They set fractures with splints, sutured wounds with human hair, drained abscesses, treated burns, and used tobacco, peyote, morning glory seeds, and hallucinogenic mushrooms both as medicines and for divination. They knew hundreds of plants. A manuscript compiled in 1552 by two educated Nahua men at the college in Tlatelolco, one writing and one painting, listed remedies and illustrated the plants, and modern pharmacologists studying it have identified compounds that do what the text claims. Their theory of disease combined natural causes, spiritual causes, and the calendar, and they had a category of sickness caused by the loss of one of the animating essences a person carried, which had to be called back. They also had a category of illness caused by the wind, and one caused by the anger of the rain gods, which afflicted people with swellings and was treated by offerings to Tlaloc. Time itself was the great organizing structure of Aztec life, more even than in most societies, because there were two calendars running at once, and their interaction shaped everything. The first was the Xiuhpohualli, the count of years of 365 days made up of 18 months of 20 days each, with 5 extra days at the end. Those 5 days, the Nemon Temi, were dead time, unlucky and dangerous. Nothing was begun. No one traveled if it could be helped. Children born then were expected to have miserable lives. People stayed home, fasted, and let the days pass. Each of the 18 months had its own great festival, and those festivals were the rhythm of the public year, tied to planting and rain and harvest. The second was the Tonalpohualli, the count of days of 260 days, made by pairing 20-day signs, Things like crocodile, wind, house, lizard, serpent, death, deer, rabbit, water, dog, monkey, grass, reed, jaguar, eagle, vulture, movement, flint, rain, flower, with the numbers 1 to 13, cycling until every combination had occurred. This was the sacred and divinatory calendar. Every day had a character. Diviners consulted painted books to read them. A day like one deer was gentle. A day like one death carried a particular fate. A day like 9 wind belonged to Quetzalcoatl. Children were named for their birthday sign, so that a man might simply be called 13 Reed, and that sign followed him. The two calendars slid against each other like two gears, and only after 52 years of 365 days did the same combination of day sign and year name come around again. 52 years. That was the Great Cycle, the century of Mesoamerica, called the binding of the years. And at the end of each one, the world might stop. The Mexica believed that the 5th sun could end at the close of any 52-year cycle. So on the last night of the cycle, they prepared for the end. All fires in every house, temple and hearth in the entire valley were put out. Household gods were thrown into the water. Pottery was smashed. Hearthstones were discarded. Pregnant women were shut into granaries and masked, because it was believed that if the world ended, they would turn into monsters and devour people. Children were kept awake and walked around and pinched and shouted at all night, because a child who slept that night would be transformed into a mouse. Then the priests, in procession, walked out of the darkened city, across the causeway, to the Hill of the Star at Iztapalapa, and climbed it and watched the sky. They were watching a particular group of stars, usually identified as the Pleiades, to see whether it would cross the meridian at midnight or stop. When it crossed, a captive was laid on the summit and killed, and a fire drill was set in the open cavity of his chest and spun until an ember caught in the tinder there. That was the new fire. When it flared, a great blaze was lit on the hilltop, visible across the whole valley, and every watching city knew that the world would continue for another 52 years. Then runners came from every town with torches, lit at that summit fire, and carried the flame back along the causeways and roads through the dark, relay after relay, to the temples, and from the temples to the Kalpuli shrines, and from the shrines to every house, so that through the small hours of the night, the whole valley slowly filled with light, spreading outward from one point, and people came out of their doorways to see it. The last time this was done was in the year 1507. The next binding of the years would have fallen in 1559. It never came. Since so much of this world turned on war, it is worth understanding what an Aztec campaign actually looked like, because it was not what most people picture. There was no standing army. There were no barracks full of professional soldiers waiting on salary. The empire had a small permanent corps, the veteran orders and the palace guard and the frontier garrisons, and everything else was raised when needed. When the ruler decided on a campaign, the order went out through the Kalpuli of the city and then to the allied and subject towns, and each unit produced its quota of men, and they marched under their own banners, with their own officers, neighbors beside neighbors. The organization was decimal in principle. Squads of 20, companies of 100, units of 400, divisions of 8,000, though real numbers were always messier. Each unit had a standard, and the standards were spectacular. A commander wore a tall frame on his back, covered in featherwork, a bird, a butterfly, a banner, a sun disk, visible over the heads of thousands of men, and the whole formation watched it. Orders were given by drum, by conch shell, and by whistle, and by the movement of that standard. When the standard fell, the unit understood that the battle was lost, and this convention was so absolute that the entire Mesoamerican art of war rested on it. It is why a small group of horsemen, riding straight at the commander, could break an army of thousands at Otumba. Logistics were the hardest part. Everything moved on backs. A campaign to the Gulf Coast might take a month of marching each way. Food was supplied by the towns along the route, which were obliged to feed a passing imperial army, an obligation they resented deeply. Ahead of the army went the merchants, who had already mapped the roads, and the couriers, and sometimes spies dressed as locals with their hair cut in local styles. The weapons were suited to a war of capture. The signature one was the makua hutul, a flat hardwood paddle about 3 or 4 feet long with channels along both edges into which prismatic obsidian blades were set with pine resin and cord. Obsidian is volcanic glass, and a fresh blade struck from a core has an edge measured in nanometers, sharper than surgical steel, sharp enough that surgeons have experimented with it. Against unarmored flesh, a makua hutul was appalling. Spanish accounts describe a horse being decapitated with one blow. The blades chipped and broke quickly, but they were cheap and replaceable, and a warrior carried spares. There was also the tepostopili, a thrusting spear with obsidian along its head, used in the front ranks. There was the atlatl, the spear thrower, an ancient device that extends the arm's leverage and drives a light dart with real force. There were bows, slings, which the Spanish came to fear more than the arrows because a stone from a sling could stun a man through a helmet, and clubs and knives. Armor was quilted cotton, soaked in brine and dried, an inch or so thick, effective against obsidian and arrows, and light enough for the heat. Over it a warrior of rank wore his tlahuizli, a close-fitting feathered suit in the colors of his order, and a helmet carved as an animal head, with his face showing in the open mouth. Shields were wicker or wood, covered in hide and feather mosaic, sometimes with a leather fringe hanging below to deflect darts at the legs. The great orders were the Eagle Warriors and the Jaguar Warriors. Both were open to commoners who had earned entry with captives, and both had their own halls in the sacred precinct where members ate and drank and were served, and where the excavators later found benches carved with processions of armed men, and, in one chamber, 2 life-sized ceramic statues of eagle warriors standing guard, which are among the finest things ever made in clay. Above them stood a small elite called the Shorn Ones, who wore their heads shaved except for a single braid, who had taken vows never to retreat a step in battle, and who, by all accounts, kept them. Battles opened with an exchange of missiles, darts and stones and arrows, then closed into a press of shields and clubs, unit against unit, with warriors of rank stepping out to seek individual opponents. The aim again was to grapple a man down and bind him. A warrior with a captive dragged him out of the line and handed him to attendants and went back in. Runners carried captives to the rear where they were secured in wooden collars for the march home. Sieges did occur, and towns had walls and ditches. But the more common pattern was to defeat the field army and then negotiate, because the goal was a functioning tributary rather than a smoking ruin. A city that surrendered before the fighting reached its temple usually kept its ruler and its people, and simply had a heavier tribute schedule imposed. A city that resisted to the end had its temple burned, which was the formal sign of conquest, drawn in the codices as a pyramid with flames coming from the roof and its top stones falling. Its ruler was often killed and replaced by a relative more agreeable to the alliance. Then the tribute clerks arrived, and this is where the empire actually lived. The whole structure was, in the end, an accounting system. Each province had an assessment recorded in painted books, listing exactly what was owed and how often, some things twice a year, some 4 times, some annually. There are surviving copies of these lists, most famously the tribute section of the Codex Mendoza, and reading them is like reading a spreadsheet in pictures. A province glyph on the left, then rows of items with number signs above them. A flag means 20, a feather means 400, a bag means 8,000. A single province might owe, in a year, 400 loads of cotton cloaks, 1,200 loads of maize, 800 loads of beans, 200 jars of honey, 40 bags of cochineal, 400 bundles of feathers, 20 bowls of gold dust, and 2 warrior costumes with shields. Multiply that across 36 provinces, and you have the wealth of Tenochtitlan. Collecting it was the work of the Kalpixk. The resident stewards, who lived in the provincial towns permanently, kept the books, supervised the storehouses, and sent the columns of porters up the roads on schedule. They were Mexica. They were not accountable to the local ruler, and they were the visible face of the empire. In the codices they are drawn walking with a fan and a staff. In the memories of the subject towns they are drawn rather differently. Nearly every account of local resentment against Tenochtitlan comes back to these men, their demands, their arrogance, and their appetites. Alongside them ran the courier system. Relay runners were posted at intervals of a few miles along the main roads, in small shelters, waiting. A message traveled by baton from one to the next at a sprint, and news could cross 100 miles in a day, faster than a horse over that terrain. Fresh fish from the Gulf Coast is said to have reached Moctezuma's table in the highlands, still edible, which, given the distance and the elevation, would be a serious achievement even now. Justice ran through a hierarchy of courts, from local Kalpuli elders to a district court, to a high court of appointed judges in the city, to the ruler himself for capital matters and for cases involving nobles. Judges were paid from state lands, so that they had no excuse to take bribes, and taking one anyway was punished with death. Trials were argued by both parties. Testimony was taken under oath, and the proceedings were recorded in pictorial form by court scribes. Punishments were harsh, and they fell harder on the powerful than on the poor, and the sources are consistent about that, even when they have every reason not to be. And that is the machine. A tribute list, a steward, a road, a runner, a court, and behind all of it, the memory of what happened to the last town that said no. It made an enormous amount of wealth flow toward one island in one lake. It also meant that the empire's grip depended entirely on being feared, and that its subjects had no positive reason at all to want it to survive. The men who fed that machine, and who died feeding it, believed they were doing something more than politics. They believed that when they fell, or when they were laid on the stone in someone else's city, they would go up with the sun in the morning and come down again with it. In the evening, for 4 years, and then turn into hummingbirds and butterflies, and spend the rest of time drinking from flowers. Which brings us to what they thought the world was actually made of. The gods of the Mexica were numerous, overlapping and slippery, and they did not fit into tidy categories. Deities merged into one another, took each other's aspects, appeared in male and female forms, and were addressed by many names. A god of rain in one town was recognizably the same being as a god of rain in another town 400 miles away, worshipped under a different name in a different language, and the Mexica accepted this easily. When they conquered a city, they did not destroy its gods. They brought the images back and installed them in a special building in the sacred precinct, a kind of divine hostage house, and kept them fed. At the top, though the word top is misleading, stood a strange abstraction, Ometeotl, the dual god, both male and female at once, who lived in the highest heaven and had made everything, and was too remote to be worshipped directly. From the dual god came 4 sons, the 4 Tezcatlipocas, associated with the 4 directions and 4 colors, and these were active in the world. The black Tezcatlipoca, smoking mirror, was the most feared and perhaps the most characteristic Aztec god. He was the god of the night sky, of sorcery, of rulership, of fate, of conflict and change and the unpredictable. He carried an obsidian mirror in which he could see everything anyone did. He was capricious and could destroy a king for amusement. He was called in prayers the enemy on both sides, and the night wind, and the one whose slaves we are. Rulers, at their coronation, prayed to him in terms of abject humility, thanking him for a burden they had not asked for, and begging him not to let them fail. The white Tezcatlipoca was Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, one of the oldest gods in Mesoamerica, worshipped at Teotihuacan 1,000 years before. He was creator, wind, the morning star, learning, the priesthood, and the arts of civilization. He was said to have brought maize to humanity by turning himself into an ant and stealing a grain from inside a mountain, and to have gone down into the land of the dead and gathered the bones of the people of the previous world and sprinkled them with his own blood to make the present humanity, which is why human beings owe a blood debt. And he was blended in memory with the legendary Toltec ruler Tepiltzin Quetzalcoatl, who had left in shame and sailed east and promised to come back. The blue Tezcatlipoca was Huitzilopochtli, the Mexica's own, latecomer among the gods just as his people were latecomers among the nations, elevated to first rank by conquest. The red one was Zeep Totec, our Lord the Flayed One, god of spring, of new growth, of goldsmiths, whose festival involved the flaying of a victim and the wearing of the skin for 20 days until it rotted off, representing the earth, putting on a new green coat over the dead husk of last year. It is one of the images from Aztec religion that most reliably horrifies modern people, and the agricultural metaphor behind it is completely transparent once explained. Then Tlaloc, ancient rain lord, and his consort, Chalclicue, she of the jade skirt, of lakes and rivers, and the water of childbirth. Then Xochiquetzal, flower feather, of love, flowers, weaving, and pleasure. Then Xochipilli, the flower prince of music, games, dance, and the sacred plants. Then Mictlantecuhtli and his wife, the lord and lady of the dead, who ruled Mictlan and were depicted as skeletons with livers hanging out. Then Mayowel of the Magi plant. Then Tezcatlipoca, again under other names, because the categories keep dissolving. And Cotlicu, mother of Huitzilopochtli, whose statue was found in 1790 in the same excavation as the Sunstone. She stands over 8 feet tall in dark stone. Her head is 2 serpents facing each other, which is what the arterial spray from a severed neck was understood to look like. She wears a necklace of severed hands and human hearts, with a skull at the center, and a skirt of woven snakes, and her feet are clawed. When she was unearthed, the university authorities looked at her and reburied her, because they were afraid the native population would begin worshipping her again. She was dug up once more some years later and buried again. She now stands in the National Museum in Mexico City, and she is, by any measure, one of the most powerful sculptures ever made by human hands. Between the gods and the people ran a great deal of ritual, and not all of it involved death. There were festivals of flowers, when the whole city was decked in marigolds, and the girls of the Calpulli danced with their hair loose. There was a month when children were given honeyed maize cakes and lifted up by the neck so that they would grow tall. There was a month for the return of the rains when whistles shaped like the rain god were blown all night, and one for the harvest, and one where the young men climbed a greased pole for a prize. There was fasting, incense, sweeping, singing, and enormous quantities of dancing, which the Spanish describe as the most constant public activity in the city after work. And there was the ball game. It was on. It was old. Versions of it had been played in Mesoamerica for at least 3,000 years, from the Olmecs onward, and the Mexica played a form called Ulialisli in a stone court shaped like a capital letter I, with sloping side walls, and in the ceremonial version, a stone ring set vertically high on each wall. The ball was solid rubber from the latex of trees in the lowlands, heavy, perhaps 4 to 8 pounds, and it hurt. Players struck it with hips, thighs, and buttocks, not hands or feet, wearing leather padding and hip yokes, and bruising was severe enough that healers sometimes had to lance the players' backsides afterward to release trapped blood. Points were scored by keeping the ball in play and forcing errors. Putting the ball through a stone ring ended the game instantly and was so difficult that it happened rarely. And when it did, the winner was traditionally entitled to the cloaks and jewelry of the spectators who ran away. The game meant something. It represented the movement of the sun and the struggle between the powers of day and night, and courts were built next to temples, and in some contexts, at some times in some places, losing players or captives dressed as players were sacrificed afterward. It was also, simultaneously and without embarrassment, a spectator sport with heavy gambling. Men bet cloaks, houses, fields, and themselves. There are records of people who gambled themselves into slavery over a ball game. Moctezuma II is supposed to have played a match against the ruler of Texcoco over a wager concerning an omen, and to have lost. Finally, there was poetry. And this is the part of Aztec culture that most surprises people who arrive expecting only knives. The Nahuatl term for poetry is in Xochitl in Quicatl, the flower and the song, a paired phrase, and pairing was the fundamental device of the whole literary tradition. Poems were sung, accompanied by the two-toned wooden drum and the upright skin drum, and performed at gatherings of nobles, and composed by named individuals whose names were remembered. There were competitions, there were assemblies of poets, there was a recognized canon, and the dominant mood of that canon is not triumph. It is a quiet, insistent, almost unbearable awareness of impermanence. The poems return again and again to the same idea. We are here only briefly. Even jade shatters, even gold is crushed, even Quetzal feathers tear. We do not live on earth forever, only a little while. Where do we go after? Does anyone truly live in the place where all go? The greatest name attached to these songs is Nezahualcoyotl of Texcoco, who we met earlier as a hunted boy hiding in the mountains from the Tepanecs. He recovered his throne with Mexica help, ruled Texcoco for more than 40 years, and made it the intellectual capital of the valley, its library and its schools more famous than those of Tenochtitlan. He designed the great dike across the lake. He built the aqueducts and the terraced pleasure gardens at Texcotzingo, cut into a hillside with pools carved from living rock, which you can still walk through today. He drafted a legal code of some 80 laws that the Triple Alliance adopted. He was, by any standard, one of the most accomplished rulers of the 15th century anywhere on Earth. He is also credited with building a temple to an unnamed and invisible god, a god with no image, whom he called the Giver of Life and the Lord of the Near and the Close, and with disliking human sacrifice, though he certainly permitted it in his own city. Later Christian writers, including his own mestizo descendant Ixtlilxochitl, who wrote the family history in Spanish, worked hard to present him as a proto-monotheist, and their evidence should be handled with tongs. What is not in doubt is the tone of the poems that carry his name, which is the tone of a man who has looked hard at power and found it thin. One of them says, in the plainest translation, that although it is of jade it breaks, although it is gold it is crushed, although it is a Quetzal feather it tears apart, and that we do not live forever on this earth, only for a short time here. Another asks whether one truly speaks on this earth, or whether we have come only to sleep, only to dream. He died in about 1472. His son Nezahulpili succeeded him and was almost as remarkable, a scholar and astronomer with a reputation for prophecy. It was Nezahulpili who executed his own principal wife for adultery, a daughter of the Mexica royal house, on the evidence of the court, refusing to make an exception, and it strained the alliance badly. And it was Nezahulpili, in the last years of the 15th century and the first years of the 16th, who is said to have warned Moctezuma II that within a few years strangers would come and take everything, and to have advised him not to bother resisting. Which brings us at last to the man himself. Moctezuma II came to power in 1502, and the first thing he did was purge the palace. His uncle Ahuitzotl had run a rough, open court full of self-made men, eagle nobles who had fought their way up from the Kalpuli, commoners in high office. Moctezuma dismissed all of them. He replaced them with men of pure noble birth, and where a commoner had held a post, he removed him and, in several reported cases, had him killed so that no resentment would linger. He announced that the sons of commoners were no longer to be educated in the palace, and that the two classes should not mix. He made the ceremony around his own person far more elaborate. Nobody could look at his face. Those entering his presence took off their sandals, put on plain cloaks over their fine ones, kept their eyes on the floor, and approached bowing, saying 3 times, Lord, my great Lord." He walked on cloth laid down before him so that his feet did not touch the ground. He ate behind a screen, alone, from a selection of dozens of dishes prepared daily and kept warm on braziers, and afterward washed his hands in water, poured by 4 women, and drank chocolate from a gold cup, and smoked a tube of tobacco and liquid amber, and dozed. Some of this was theater, and the Mexica understood theater. Some of it was religious, a ruler made semi-divine by the office. But taken together with the purge, it suggests a man who was insecure about the foundations of his own legitimacy, and who tried to fix the problem by raising the walls. He was not idle or soft. He campaigned personally and successfully in Oaxaca and on the Gulf Coast, and against the Mixtecs and the Zapotecs, and he pushed the empire's tribute machinery harder than any of his predecessors, adding provinces and raising quotas. He reorganized the tribute system into 38 provinces with resident collectors, and those collectors were hated, and the hatred is a thread we will need shortly. He also failed to solve the 2 problems that had defeated everyone before him. Tlaxcala, the small hard confederation east of the mountains, was still independent, still surrounded, still fighting flower wars against him, still hungry and salt-starved and utterly unbroken, and the Purepecha in the west were still there behind their fortified line. And then, in his later years, things began to go strangely. The Nahuatl Chronicles, above all the 12th book of the great Florentine Codex compiled by Sahagun from elderly Mexica informants in the middle of the century, describe a series of omens in the decade before the Spanish came. A tongue of fire appeared in the eastern sky at midnight and burned there for a year, and people struck their hands against their mouths and cried out when they saw it. The temple of Huitzilopochtli burned without cause, and the more water was thrown on it, the higher the flames rose. Lightning struck a temple of the fire god on a day with no thunder, only a light rain. A comet crossed the sky in the daytime, throwing off sparks, and the people howled. The lake boiled up without wind and flooded houses. A woman's voice was heard weeping in the night streets, crying out that her children must go away now, asking where she could take them. A strange bird was brought to Moctezuma with a mirror in its head, and looking into it he saw the night sky at midday, and then saw people coming, masked and warlike, riding on the backs of deer. Every professional historian who deals with this material says the same thing. These accounts were written down decades after the conquest by people who had lived through the catastrophe, in a world where their gods had failed, and their city was gone, and their new masters expected them to explain how it had happened. Omen literature of exactly this kind existed in Europe and in Mesoamerica before contact, and it is a standard way for any culture to make an unbearable event feel like part of an order. The omens are almost certainly retrospective. That does not make them worthless. It makes them a record of grief rather than a record of astronomy. The related and even more famous story is that Moctezuma believed the Spanish leader was Quetzalcoatl, returning from the east in the year 1 Reed, which was indeed the year 1519, and was indeed the year associated with the god's departure. This story is repeated in almost every popular account of the conquest. It should be treated with great suspicion. It appears most strongly in Spanish sources, above all in the letters of the invaders themselves, who had an obvious interest in claiming that the lord of the land had recognized their divine right to it and surrendered voluntarily. It appears in Nahuatl sources too, but those were written after decades of Spanish influence by writers educated by friars. Some scholars argue the whole returning god narrative was largely constructed after the fact by both sides. Others think there was a genuine strand of Mexica thought that treated the newcomers as ambiguous beings of uncertain category, neither clearly gods nor clearly men, which is not the same thing as worshipping them. What is clear is that Moctezuma had real information and reacted to it cautiously rather than mystically. Because the news had been coming for years. The Caribbean had been in Spanish hands since 1492. Cuba was conquered in 1511. Mesoamerican trade networks ran up the Gulf Coast and around Yucatan, and the Pocteca reported everything. In 1517, an expedition under Hernandez de Cordoba landed on the Yucatan coast and was badly beaten by the Maya at Champoton. In 1518, Juan de Grijalva came along the coast further west, traded, and was seen. Moctezuma had painted reports made of the ships, of the men, of their beards and their clothing, and the couriers brought them to him, and he consulted his advisors, and he sent gifts out to the coast, and he sent watchers to sit on the shore and report. The gifts are usually read as either worship or bribery. They were probably neither exactly. In the diplomatic language of Mesoamerica, an overwhelming gift was a statement of superiority, a demonstration that the giver had so much that this cost him nothing, and a challenge. It could also be a test to see what the recipient wanted most. If so, the test worked perfectly and the answer was gold. In February of 1519, 11 ships left Cuba against the express last-minute orders of the governor, who had come to distrust the man he had appointed to lead them. That man was Hernán Cortés, 34 years old, from Extremadura in western Spain, minor gentry, educated for 2 years in law at Salamanca before dropping out, in the Indies since he was 19. A plantation owner and municipal official in Cuba, with a reputation for charm, litigiousness, gambling, and womanizing. He had 500 and some soldiers, about 100 sailors, 16 horses, 14 cannon of various sizes, a handful of crossbows and arquebuses, several war dogs, and no legal authority whatsoever. The horses matter enormously, and it is easy to underrate them. Nobody in Mesoamerica had ever seen one. There were no large domesticated animals at all beyond the dog and the turkey. A man on a horse, in armor, with a lance, charging on open ground, was not a soldier with an advantage. He was a category error. The steel matters too, though less than films suggest. Spanish swords cut through quilted cotton armor and did not shatter, and steel helmets and breastplates turned obsidian blades. But the Spanish also adopted Mexican quilted cotton armor within weeks because it was cooler and worked well enough, and their guns were slow and unreliable, and mostly useful for noise. Cannon terrified people the first 2 or 3 times, and then stopped terrifying them. What mattered most was none of these things. It was politics and disease. Cortés touched at Cozumel, then sailed around Yucatan, and there had 2 pieces of luck that decided everything. The first was a man named Jerónimo de Aguilar, a Spanish priest shipwrecked 8 years earlier and living among the Maya as a slave, who had learned Yucatec Maya fluently and who came aboard weeping. The second came a few weeks later at Potonchan, where the Spanish fought a battle, won it with cavalry on open ground, and were given 20 women as part of the peace settlement. One of those women had been born to a noble family in a Nahuatl-speaking town on the Gulf Coast, and, after her father's death, had been sold or given away into Maya country, where she had learned Maya. She was probably not yet 20. The Spanish baptized her Marina and called her Dona Marina. In Nahuatl, she was called Malintzin, the reverential form, and from that the Spanish ear made Malinche, and that is the name history has kept. She spoke Nahuatl and Maya. Aguilar spoke Maya and Spanish. Between the 2 of them, a chain of translation existed from the moment Cortés needed it, and it was the single most valuable asset the expedition possessed. Within a year, she had learned Spanish herself and worked alone. She translated, but she did far more than translate. She explained, she advised. She read the politics of towns the Spanish had never heard of, and told Cortés who hated whom. Nahuatl accounts of the conquest routinely show her at the center of scenes, speaking, and the painted codices show her standing beside Cortés, with the scroll symbol of speech coming from her mouth, larger than the men around her. The Mexica came to call Cortés himself by her name, the captain of Malintzin. She has been argued about in Mexico for 5 centuries. Traitor to her people, though the Mexica were not her people and had enslaved her. Mother of a nation, since her son by Cortés is often called the first mestizo. Survivor doing what a captured woman in her position could do. All of these have been fought over in books, murals, and politics, and the argument is not settled and probably should not be. In April of 1519, on the dunes near what became Veracruz, on the day the Christian calendar called Good Friday, the ships anchored, and the men came ashore, and the messengers of Moctezuma came down to meet them with gifts. The gifts sent down to the coast were extraordinary, and they were also, in hindsight, a catastrophic misjudgment. There were 2 great discs, one of gold worked with the sun, and one of silver worked with the moon, each the size of a cartwheel. There were feather headdresses, jade, gold ornaments in the shape of animals, embroidered cotton, and food. The Spanish took the gold, weighed it, and asked where it came from. There were also 2 ceremonial costumes of God sent for Cortés to wear, which some read as an attempt to place him inside a Mexica religious category, and there were priests who came with the envoys and, seeing the strangers, sacrificed captives in front of them and offered them tortillas soaked in the blood. The Spanish recoiled and refused, and the envoys reported this too. Moctezuma's response was to send more gifts and to forbid the strangers to approach the capital. This is the strategy of a man who wants a problem to go away without a war he cannot easily calculate. It has been called cowardice by 5 centuries of writers, most of them Spanish, and it looks different if you consider what he was actually facing. A small, unknown force on the coast, backed by a fleet, arriving in the territory of his most restless tributaries, whose capabilities his scouts could not properly assess. Attacking them meant marching an army down into the Fever Coast. Ignoring them was cheap. Buying them off was cheaper still. What he could not have predicted was that the gifts would work as advertising. Then the Spanish went inland a short distance to Cempoala, a Totonac city near the coast, and there the empire's real weakness came into the light. The Lord of Cempoala, whom Spanish soldiers remembered as an enormously fat man, received them, and, once he was sure of privacy, complained bitterly. His people had been conquered by the Mexica within living memory. They paid crushing tribute. Their sons were taken for sacrifice. Their daughters were taken by officials. He hated Tenochtitlan with an entire heart, and so did every town along that coast. While the Spanish were there, 5 Mexica tribute collectors arrived, walking through the town with flowers in their hands and attendants, sweeping the path before them, so arrogant that they did not even look at the strangers. Cortés told the Totonacs to arrest them. The Totonacs were appalled and afraid, he insisted. They did it. Then, in the night, Cortés quietly released 2 of the prisoners, told them he was their friend and had nothing to do with the outrage, and sent them back to Moctezuma. In the morning he blamed the Totonacs for letting them escape, and took the remaining 3 into his own protection, which made him simultaneously the Totonacs' guarantor and the Mexica's apparent well-wisher. It is a small episode, and it shows exactly what kind of man had arrived. Within days, 30 Totonac towns had renounced tribute to Tenochtitlan and declared for the strangers, and could no longer step back, because they had committed treason and needed their new protectors to survive it. Cortés then founded a town on the coast, Villarica de la Vera Cruz, and had its brand new council, composed of his own men, appoint him captain general, thereby manufacturing a legal authority independent of the governor of Cuba. He sent a ship straight to Spain with the treasure and a letter to the king, and when a faction of his men plotted to take another ship back to Cuba, he hanged 2 of them, cut off the feet of a pilot, and then ran the remaining ships aground and stripped them so that there was no way home. This is usually told as burning the boats, which is not quite what happened, but the effect was the same. 400 and some men marched inland in August of 1519, up out of the coastal heat into the mountains, with 1,000 Totonac porters and warriors, toward a city they had been told was the greatest in the world. The road went through Tlaxcala. The Tlaxcalans had been fighting the Triple Alliance for generations. They were a confederation of 4 provinces with a ruling council rather than a single king, hemmed in on every side, unable to get salt or cotton, defiant and poor. When they heard that strangers were coming up the road, accompanied by Totonacs who had been Mexica subjects, they assumed the worst and attacked. The fighting lasted about 2 weeks, and it was the hardest of the whole campaign. Spanish accounts, which are not modest, admit that they were nearly overwhelmed, that they fought in formation, day after day, that horses were killed, that men died, that at night they dressed their wounds with the fat of dead enemies because they had no other salve, and that some of the soldiers begged Cortés to turn back. The Tlaxcalan commander, Xicotencatl the Younger, attacked in enormous numbers on open ground, then at night, then with feigned peace embassies, and lost each time, because massed infantry attacking cavalry and gunpowder on flat terrain loses, and because his aim was still to take captives rather than to kill. Then the Tlaxcalan Council did the arithmetic and changed sides entirely. If these strangers could beat Tlaxcala, they could beat Tenochtitlan. And Tlaxcala had spent a century waiting for exactly such an instrument. They made peace, feasted the Spanish for weeks, gave them noble daughters, and offered an army. This is the moment the conquest becomes possible. Everything after it is a Tlaxcalan war with Spanish shock troops attached. Tens of thousands of indigenous warriors fought against Tenochtitlan, and without them, a few hundred Europeans could not have taken a city of that size, any more than a few hundred men could take Paris. Mexican historians have insisted on this point for a long time, and it has slowly become the mainstream view. and it changes the story from a fable about steel and destiny into something much more ordinary and much sadder. An empire that had made itself feared and hated for 90 years found, at the crisis, that its subjects preferred anyone else. From Tlaxcala, the combined force went to Cholula, and Cholula is a stain that has never washed out. Cholula was an ancient holy city, home to the largest pyramid by volume in the world, a vast layered mound dedicated to Quetzalcoatl, so large that a church now sits on top of it, and most visitors mistake it for a hill. It was allied with Tenochtitlan and hostile to Tlaxcala. The Spanish were received there, then housed, then, according to Cortés and to Malinche, warned by a local noblewoman that an ambush was being prepared, that pits with stakes had been dug in the streets, and that a Mexica army waited outside. Cortés summoned the nobility of Cholula into a walled courtyard, closed the entrances, and had them killed. Then the Tlaxcalans came into the city. The killing went on for hours. Estimates of the dead run from 3,000 to 6,000. Temples were burned. The city was looted. Whether there was a genuine plot is unknowable now. Cortés said there was. Tlaxcalan sources said there was, and they wanted Cholula destroyed. Later Spanish critics, above all the Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas, who spent his life denouncing the conquest, said flatly that it was a deliberate massacre designed to terrorize the entire region before the march on the capital. Whatever the truth of the plot, the effect was exactly the second thing. The news of Cholula went ahead of the army, and towns that had been wavering opened their gates. Moctezuma sent more embassies, offering annual tribute to the King of Spain, offering anything, asking them not to come. He also, according to the sources, considered blocking the passes, considered ambush in the mountains, considered abandoning the city, and consulted his council, which was divided. His nephew Cacama argued for receiving them. His brother Cuitlahuac argued for keeping them out by force, and said, in a line the chroniclers preserved, that once they were let into the house, they would not be got out again. Moctezuma decided to let them in. Historians have argued about that decision for 500 years, and there is no consensus. Perhaps he wanted to see them at close range. Perhaps he calculated that inside the city, on the causeways, with the bridges liftable, a few hundred foreigners could be annihilated at any moment of his choosing, which was militarily true. Perhaps the religious ambiguity paralyzed him. Perhaps he was simply a cautious administrator confronted with something outside every category he had, doing what cautious administrators do, which is postpone. In early November of 1519, the Spanish came over the pass between the two great volcanoes, Popocatépetl smoking on their left, and came out on the high ground above the valley, and saw the lake below them with the cities standing in it, white and gleaming, the causeways running out across the water, the temples rising, canoes moving in every direction like insects on a pond. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who was there as a young soldier, and who wrote his account as an old man in Guatemala 50 years later, still angry that the credit had gone to others, wrote that they stood amazed and said it was like the enchantments in the old books of chivalry, that some of the soldiers asked whether what they saw was a dream. Then they went down. On the 8th of November, 1519, they walked up the southern causeway from Iztapalapa in a long column, cavalry first, then the guns, then the Spanish foot, then several thousand Tlaxcalan warriors, and the water on both sides was crowded with canoes, and the causeway itself was packed with people who had come out to look, and the roofs of the lake towns were full. At the place where the causeway from Coyoacán joined the main road, at a fortified junction, the procession stopped, and Moctezuma came out to meet them. He came in a litter carried on the shoulders of nobles, under a canopy of green feathers worked with gold and silver and pearls. He stepped down onto cloth laid on the road, and the lords supported him on either side, and men went before him sweeping and spreading mantles so that his feet did not touch the ground, and everyone else in the road looked at the floor. Cortés dismounted and came forward and tried to embrace him, and was blocked by the two lords, because no one touched the Tlatoani. Instead, they exchanged necklaces, Cortés giving a string of glass beads scented with musk, and Moctezuma giving a collar of golden shrimps on red shell. Moctezuma spoke a formal greeting. Cortés replied through Aguilar and Malinche. Then the Spanish were led into the city and housed in the palace of Axayacatl, Moctezuma's father, a huge complex facing the sacred precinct, and given food, and the doors were left open, and for a week everything was cordial and strange. They were shown the city. They climbed the great temple, 114 steps, with Moctezuma sending men down to help Cortés up, an offer he refused. From the top they could see the whole valley, and the market at Tlatelolco with its noise carrying across the city, and the causeways, and the aqueduct. They also saw the shrines, and the stone, and the walls caked black, and the smell, which every Spanish account mentions with disgust. Cortés suggested, on the spot, that a cross be put up there, and the idols removed, and Moctezuma was extremely angry, and the moment passed. They found, in the palace where they were staying, a sealed door, and opened it, and behind it was the treasury of Axayacatl, gold and jade and feather, work in quantity. They sealed it again and said nothing and thought about it constantly. And then, within a week, Cortés seized Moctezuma. The pretext was an incident on the coast, where a Mexica commander had attacked the Spanish garrison at Veracruz and killed several men, one of whose heads was sent inland to be displayed. Cortés went to Moctezuma with an armed party, accused him of ordering it, and told him that he must come and live in the Spanish quarters as a guest, and that if he cried out or resisted, he would be killed at once. After hours of argument, Moctezuma went. He lived under guard for about 8 months. He continued to rule in form. Nobles came to him and he gave orders, and they were obeyed. He gave the Spanish the treasury, which was melted into bars. He was taught games and played them with his captors and gave away his winnings. He appears in Bernal Diaz's memory as courteous, dignified, and very sad, playing a Mexican board game with a Spanish page and laughing at his cheating. But the city was watching its ruler live in a foreigner's house, and the nobility hardened, and men began to say openly that the Tlatoani had been unmanned. Cuitlahuac, his brother, and Cacama of Texcoco were arrested when they objected too loudly. In April of 1520, a Spanish fleet of 19 ships and about 900 men arrived at Veracruz under Panfilo de Narvaez, sent by the governor of Cuba to arrest Cortés for insubordination. Cortés left about 120 men in Tenochtitlan under his lieutenant Pedro de Alvarado, marched to the coast with the rest, attacked Narvaez at night in the rain, defeated him, put out his eye, and then persuaded nearly the entire defeated army to join him with promises of gold. He came back to the valley with more than 1,000 Spanish soldiers and dozens of horses. He came back to a war. While he was away, the festival of Toxcatl had come around, the great celebration of Tezcatlipoca, held in the sacred precinct, with hundreds of the young nobility dancing in ornament and feathers, unarmed, watched by a crowd. Alvarado had given permission for it, on condition there be no sacrifice. Then, partway through, the Spanish closed the entrances of the precinct and attacked the dancers. The Nahuatl account in the Florentine Codex is the most harrowing passage in the whole literature of the conquest, and it is written by people who were there or whose parents were. It describes the drummers' arms Memphis being cut through, the dancers cut down where they stood, men trying to climb the walls and being killed, blood running like water, and the crowd outside hearing the sound and understanding. Alvarado said afterward that he had received intelligence of a planned uprising and had struck first. The Mexica said he had wanted the gold on the dancers. Modern historians mostly regard it as a panicked, preemptive massacre by a frightened commander with a reputation for violence. Whatever the motive, it ended everything. The city rose. The Spanish were besieged in the palace of Axayacatl, cut off from food and water, until Cortés returned in June and forced his way in to join them, which multiplied the number of men trapped without solving anything. Cortés brought Moctezuma up onto the roof and had him speak to the crowd and ask them to let the Spanish leave. The accounts diverge violently here. Spanish sources say the crowd shouted him down, called him a woman and a coward, and threw stones, and that one struck him on the head, and he died of it 3 days later, refusing baptism and refusing food. Nahuatl sources, and several later Spanish ones, say the Spanish killed him themselves when he had become useless, and that his body was thrown out into the street with knife wounds in it. He was about 52 years old. He had ruled 17 years. His people had by then chosen his brother Cuitlahuac, the one who had warned against letting them in, as the new Tlatoani. On the night of the 30th of June, 1520, in the rain, the Spanish tried to escape. They had been trapped for days, out of food, taking casualties from crossbow and sling and stone from the rooftops, and their causeway bridges had been removed by the defenders. They built a portable wooden bridge to lay across the gaps. They loaded as much gold as they could carry, and Cortés told the men to take what they wanted from the pile that could not be transported. And the newest arrivals from the Narvaez expedition, who had not yet learned anything, filled their clothing and their packs with it. They went out at midnight along the western causeway toward Tlacopan, in silence, in drizzle, and got across the first gap on their bridge. Then a woman drawing water saw them and called out, and the drums began on the great temple, and the lake filled with canoes. The portable bridge jammed in the first gap and could not be lifted. What followed was not a battle. It was a slaughter on a narrow raised road in the dark, with warriors coming up out of canoes on both sides, and men falling into the water, and the gaps filling with bodies and baggage and dead horses, until the survivors ran across on top of them. Somewhere between 600 and 800 Spaniards died that night, more than half the force, along with several thousand Tlaxcalans. All the artillery was lost. Most of the horses were lost. The great majority of the treasure went into the lake, and the men who had loaded themselves most heavily with gold went straight to the bottom under its weight, which every chronicler notes with grim satisfaction. Prisoners were taken alive and sacrificed on the great temple over the following days, in full view of the survivors, who could hear the drums from the mainland. The Spanish call it La Noche Triste, the sad night. In Mexico, it has been officially renamed the Night of Victory. Cortés is supposed to have sat down under a great cypress tree at Tacuba and wept, and a descendant of that tree stood in Mexico City until it died in the 20th century. The remnant fled north around the lake, harried the whole way, wounded, starving, eating the horses that died. At Otumba, they were caught in the open by a large Mexica army and should have been destroyed, and were saved when Cortés and a handful of horsemen charged directly at the enemy commander, visible by his standard, and killed him, and the army broke apart. Because Mesoamerican battle formations were organized around the standard, and its fall meant defeat, they limped into Tlaxcala, expecting to be finished off by their allies. Tlaxcala took them in, fed them, treated their wounds, and after a long and bitter council, decided to continue the alliance. Xicotencatl the Younger argued for killing them and was overruled by his own father and by the other lords, who reasoned that the Mexica would never forgive Tlaxcala now and that the only way out was forward. They were right about the first part. Something had come into the valley with the Narvaez expedition that no army could have stopped and no wall could have kept out. Smallpox had reached the mainland in 1520, carried, according to tradition, by an enslaved African man in the Narvaez fleet who was ill on arrival. It moved through the Totonac coast, up the roads into Tlaxcala and into Tenochtitlan in the autumn, about 6 weeks after the Spanish had been driven out. The Nahuatl account describes it plainly, and it is very hard to read. Great sores broke out on people, it says, on the face, on the chest, on the belly, everywhere, so many and so close together that the sick could not move or turn over or lie face down, and if they were moved, they screamed. Many died of the disease, and many died of hunger, because there was no one left standing to bring them food or water, and whole households died together in their houses, and there was no room to bury them, and no one able to do it, and the houses were pulled down over the dead. The population of the Americas had been separated from the Old World disease pool for something like 15,000 years. There had been no domesticated herd animals of the kind that in Eurasia and Africa incubated influenzas and poxes and passed them to human beings over millennia. There was, consequently, no acquired or inherited resistance to smallpox, measles, typhus, mumps, or influenza in any population on 2 continents. The epidemic in Tenochtitlan lasted about 60 days. It is thought to have killed a very large share of the city, possibly a third or more, and it killed disproportionately the adults who were fighting and organizing rather than the very young. Among the dead was Cuitlahuac, the new Tlatoani, who had ruled for 80 days and had beaten the Spanish out of the city and might have been the man to hold it together. The council met again, as it always did, and chose a young man of about 25, a nephew of Moctezuma, son of Ahuitzotl, ruler of Tlatelolco and a proven war leader. His name was Cuauhtemoc, descending eagle or falling eagle, and he was the last Tlatoani of the Mexica. He inherited a city that had buried a third of itself in a valley where the subject towns were watching to see which way to jump, with an enemy in Tlaxcala rebuilding and reinforced by every new ship that reached Veracruz. He spent the winter preparing anyway. He strengthened the causeway defenses, sharpened stakes into the shallow water to hold boats, dug pits in the streets, stockpiled food, sent embassies to the Purepecha in the west, asking for an alliance against a common threat, and was refused. He executed nobles suspected of negotiating. Cortes spent the same winter doing something clever. He had a shipwright named Martin Lopez build 13 brigantines, small sailing vessels with cannon mounted in the bow, in Tlaxcala, 60 miles from the lake and over a mountain range. They were built, tested on a river, taken apart, and carried in pieces on the backs of thousands of Tlaxcalan porters over the passes and down to Texcoco, where a canal was dug to launch them. Those ships decided the siege. Tenochtitlan's whole defense assumed control of the water. Canoes could swarm a causeway and take an army in the flank. A brigantine with a gun and a sail running before the wind could cut a line of canoes in half and run them down, and once the Spanish held the lake, the causeways became narrow corridors that could be attacked from both ends and cut off from resupply. By the spring of 1521, the alliance against Tenochtitlan had grown enormous. Texcoco, the old partner of the Triple Alliance, split, and its larger faction joined the Spanish. Chalco joined. Xochimilco was taken. The Otomi towns joined. Estimates of the indigenous forces at the siege range from 50,000 to over 150,000, alongside perhaps 900 Spaniards. This was a Mesoamerican civil war with a European contingent in it. The siege began at the end of May 1521 and lasted 93 days. The first act was to cut the aqueduct at Chapultepec. Tenochtitlan had almost no fresh water of its own. From that day, the defenders were drinking brackish lake water and digging pits for seepage, and dysentery began. Then the causeways were taken, one by one, each held at its landward end so that nothing came in. Canoes still slipped through at night, but the brigantines hunted them. Then came the fighting in the city itself, and it went badly for the attackers for weeks. The Spanish would advance along a causeway or a street during the day, take ground, and withdraw at nightfall. And the Mexica would reopen the canal breaches and rebuild the barricades in the dark, so that the same ground had to be taken again the next morning. Fighting in the narrow streets between high, flat-roofed houses, under a constant rain of stones and darts from above, cavalry useless, was exactly the kind of war the Mexica were best at. In one assault in late June, the Spanish pushed too far, were counterattacked, and lost dozens of men taken alive. Cortés himself was seized and dragged and rescued by his own soldiers, one of whom lost an arm doing it. That evening, the shrine drum on the great temple began, and the besiegers on the causeways watched their comrades stripped, plumed, and made to dance on the platform at the top, and then killed. One after another, with the whole city watching, and afterward the heads were set up on poles facing the camps. Bernal Diaz, an old man writing decades later, said that he could still hear the sound of that drum, and that it was the most dismal thing in the world. The Mexica priests then prophesied publicly that within 8 days the invaders would all be dead, and the wavering allies drew back and left the Spanish camps thin. The 8 days passed. Nothing happened. The allies came back. Cortés changed method. He stopped trying to hold ground and started demolishing it. Every building taken was pulled down, and the rubble was used to fill the canals, so that horses and guns could move on level ground, and there would be no rooftops to shoot from. Tens of thousands of Allied laborers did this work, street by street, day after day, week after week, so that the army advanced across a widening field of flat wreckage into the shrinking remainder of the city. They were unbuilding Tenochtitlan by hand, in the same way it had been built. Inside the shrinking perimeter, the survivors were eating lizards, grass, the bark of trees, worms, mud from the walls, the leather of shields. They drank the salt water, and it killed them. Bodies lay in the houses and the streets. Smallpox had gone, but dysentery and starvation had replaced it. The Nahuatl accounts say that people no longer had strength to cry out. Cuauhtémoc refused every offer of terms. Cortés sent captured nobles back to him repeatedly with proposals, and the answer never changed. A Spanish account records a Mexican noble replying that they would all die where they stood, and asking the invaders to look around and see how many of them were already dead, and to count how many more there were left to kill. By early August, the Mexica held only the northern part of the island, the district of Tlatelolco, packed with refugees, perhaps a fifth of the city, and the fighting had reached the market square, where 60,000 people had once traded. On the 13th of August, 1521, the last resistance broke. Cuauhtémoc took a canoe with his family and a few nobles and tried to cross the lake, and was intercepted by a brigantine and captured. He was brought before Cortés, and the accounts say he touched the dagger at the Spaniard's belt and asked to be killed with it, saying that he had done what he could for his city and his people, and could do no more. He was not killed then. He was kept, and his feet were burned with oil in an attempt to make him reveal where the treasure from the sad night had been hidden, and he told them, apparently truthfully, that most of it was in the lake. He was hanged 4 years later on a march to Honduras. on an accusation of conspiracy that his own captors did not really believe. That afternoon it rained hard, with thunder, and the survivors were allowed to leave the city. And they came out for 3 days along the causeways, tens of thousands of them, starving, filthy, carrying children, past lines of soldiers who searched them and took the young women and branded some of the men, and walked away into the towns around the lake. The Nahuatl poets who survived wrote about it afterward, and their lines have been translated many times and still land like a stone. Broken spears lie in the roads. We have torn our hair in grief. The walls are splashed with gore. Worms swarm in the streets. We have eaten lizards and salt grass and mud. We have drunk brackish water. We beat our hands against the adobe walls, and our inheritance was a net of holes. Estimates for the dead in the siege range enormously, from 100,000 to 240,000, counting combat, starvation, and disease together. The city that had held perhaps 200,000 people held almost nobody. What happened next is, in its own quiet way, as strange as anything that came before. Cortés did not move the capital. He could have built somewhere healthier, on the shore, on solid ground. Instead, he decided to rebuild on the ruins, on the same island, in the same place, using the same stones. The great temple was pulled down, and its blocks were carted a short distance and laid into the foundations of the cathedral. The palace of the Tlatoani became the site of the viceregal palace, which is the national palace today. The sacred precinct became the main square, the Zocalo. Indigenous laborers, working under Spanish supervision, rebuilt on the grid of the city they had just been made to destroy, and the canals ran for another century before they were filled in one by one. The lake was the real casualty. Spanish Mexico City flooded repeatedly, catastrophically in 1629, when waters stood in the streets for 5 years. The answer chosen was to drain the whole basin, and that project ran from the 17th century into the 20th, a vast tunnel and canal system cutting the valley open to the north. The lakes are gone now. Small remnants survive at Xochimilco, where you can still ride a flat boat between chinampas that are still farmed, and where the old technique is being studied again by agronomists who find that it outperforms modern methods on the same ground. The draining had a consequence nobody wanted. Without the lake, the clay bed beneath the city dried and compacted, and Mexico City began to sink. Parts of it have dropped more than 30 feet in the last century. The cathedral leans. The floors of colonial buildings slope, and the water table, overpumped, keeps falling. The empire itself dissolved fast, because it had always been a tribute network rather than a nation. The Spanish simply took over the network. Tribute lists were translated and reissued. Provincial lords who had paid Tenochtitlan now paid the crown. The encomienda system granted Spaniards the right to the labor and tribute of specified towns, and it was brutal, and it was fought over in Spain itself by men like Las Casas, and eventually restricted, too late for most. The disease did not stop. Smallpox was only the first. In 1545 and again in 1576, epidemics of something the Nahuas called Cocalistli swept central Mexico and killed on a scale that dwarfed the conquest, possibly a hemorrhagic fever, possibly a salmonella strain, argued about by paleogeneticists to this day. The population of central Mexico, whatever it had been in 1519, and estimates range from about 5 million to more than 25, fell by something in the order of 90% over the following century. There is no comfortable way to say that number. Tlaxcala, which had made the whole thing possible, was rewarded with privileges. Exemption from most tribute, the right to bear arms and ride horses, coats of arms for its lords. Its people were used as colonists and soldiers all over New Spain for the next 2 centuries. It kept its privileges longer than almost any other indigenous community, and it has spent 500 years being called traitors by other Mexicans, which is a hard bargain. Malinche had a son by Cortés, Martin, and was later married to a Spanish nobleman, and died young, probably in her late 20s, probably of one of the epidemics, and the culture did not vanish. This is the part that gets left out of the story most often. Nahuatl did not die. It became, for 2 centuries, an administrative language of New Spain, written in the Latin alphabet, used in wills, land deeds, town council records, petitions and letters, tens of thousands of which survive in archives, and which historians have been reading closely for the last 50 years. Producing a picture of colonial indigenous life from the inside, rather than through Spanish eyes. Around 1.5 million people speak Nahuatl today, in Mexico, in many dialects, and it has given English chocolate, tomato, avocado, chili, coyote, ocelot, shack, and a dozen more words you use without thinking. The friars, who had come to erase the old religion, also preserved it, out of a mixture of scholarly obsession and the practical need to recognize heresy. Bernardino de Sahagún spent decades at the College of Santa Cruz at Tlatelolco, working with trilingual Nahua students, interviewing elders, having them dictate in their own language, and painting the illustrations themselves, producing 12 books covering the gods, the calendar, rhetoric, natural history, the professions, and the conquest. The Spanish crown eventually ordered the work confiscated, fearing it would keep the old religion alive. Copies survived in Europe. Almost everything we know about the interior life of the Mexica comes from it, and from a handful of surviving painted books, and from the ground. And the ground keeps giving things back. The Templo Mayor excavation, running since 1978, has produced over 200 offering caches. In 2011, they found the great stone of the earth goddess Tlaltecutli, weighing 12 tons, and beneath it a shaft with jaguar skeletons wearing jade collars and the bones of children, and a golden ornament. Every few years another chamber opens. So what was it in the end? It was a state that lasted less than 200 years, from a mud bank to a hemisphere spanning tribute empire, built by a people who were despised when they arrived, and who never really stopped behaving like latecomers with something to prove. It made land where there was water. It fed a city of 200,000 without a single wheel or a single draft animal. It ran a market whose scale astonished men who had seen Constantinople. It taught every one of its children, boys and girls, commoners and nobles, in schools. It produced sculpture that stops people in a museum corridor 5 centuries later, and poems about the shortness of life that could have been written last week. It also fed its temples with the hearts of human beings, in public as policy, and it made itself so thoroughly hated by the peoples it ruled that when the moment came, they lined up in their tens of thousands to help pull it down. Both of those are true, and neither cancels the other. That is usually how it is with empires. We just prefer the ones far enough away that the details have worn smooth. Tonight, if you were standing in the middle of Mexico City, in the Zocalo, on the flagstones, you would be standing on top of all of it. The temple is directly beneath the northeast corner, partly excavated, open to the air. The cathedral leans a little to one side because the lake is still down there, still soft, still settling. Somewhere under the traffic there is a layer of ash and broken plaster from August of 1521, and under that the older temples, one inside another, like the rings of a tree, and under those the black mud of the lake bed, and in the mud, willow stakes driven in by hand by people who had nothing 700 years ago, to make a field where there was only water. And here our story settles into stillness. The eagle has long since gone from the cactus. The lake is dry, The canals are paved, the drums are quiet on the Hill of the Star, and the fires that were carried out along the causeways in the dark have all been out for a very long time. But the maze still grows. The words are still spoken. The stones are still there, under the floor, waiting patiently in the dark for someone to lift them. There is nothing left for you to do now. Let your shoulders go soft. Let the names drift away, the long ones and the short ones, the cities and the gods, and let them settle like silt on the bottom of a still lake. Rest now. Let it go. Sleep well, and good night.